Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark and the underworld breathes just beneath the surface. Tonight, we drift into the world of a man who lived two lives. A quiet suburban father by day, and New Jersey's most dangerous secret by night. Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo, the real-life inspiration behind Tony Soprano. A mob boss who didn't roar to control the room. He simply existed, and the room bent around him. A man who hid an entire criminal empire behind backyard barbecues, family dinners, and the illusion of an ordinary life. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? We love watching our little underworld grow across countries, cities, and time zones. And hey, if you're new here, or if you always forget, tap that subscribe button and hit the bell. Not because it helps the channel, but because every story we tell drags you deeper into the shadows, and you don't want to miss a single descent. Now, take a slow breath, let the noise of the day fade away, and sink with us into the quiet, suburban darkness of New Jersey's most secretive mafia boss. The story of Vincent Palermo does not begin with a crown, a title, or even the quiet confidence he would one day be feared for. It begins with a small boy standing in the doorway of a cramped Brooklyn apartment, watching a man count money on a kitchen table. The bills were stacked in neat piles, arranged with the kind of precision a jeweler might use when laying out diamonds. The boy didn't know what the money meant, or why men with heavy coats kept knocking on the door long after midnight. He only knew that the room felt tense, like everyone was waiting for a storm they couldn't see. Years later, he would remember the way the man stopped counting and glanced over his shoulder when he realized he was being watched. That single moment, quiet but sharp, stayed with him forever. Vincent was born into a world where survival wasn't a skill, but a reflex. His childhood in Brooklyn didn't offer much softness, only the raw noise and grit of post-war streets where Italian-American families crowded into tight spaces, their lives shaped by long work hours and louder expectations. Children learned early that adults carried burdens that couldn't be spoken out loud. Rent was always due, paychecks were always short, and sometimes the only difference between a friend and a threat was how fast you could read the mood in a room. In those days, silence wasn't shyness. It was armor. Moving through those streets, Vincent learned to listen more than he talked. He watched men lean against storefronts, their eyes scanning for police cars, their conversations cut off the second a stranger passed. Everyone seemed to be guarding something. Some guarded fear, others guarded ambition, and a few guarded secrets that could snap a neighborhood in half if spoken to the wrong ears. When Vincent was still young, the family moved across the river to Elizabeth, New Jersey. To outsiders, the shift looked small, almost forgettable. Just a family chasing steadier work and quieter streets. But for Vincent, it was a rebirth that shaped the rest of his life. Elizabeth carried a different kind of energy, less frantic than Brooklyn, more intimate. The houses stood closer together, the windows stayed open in the summer, and everyone knew who lived behind each door. But beneath the neighborly greetings and the smell of Sunday gravy, there was something else humming quietly, something older than the city itself. The undercurrent of organized crime flowed through New Jersey like a hidden river, and in Elizabeth, you didn't need directions to find where it surfaced. Italian-American neighborhoods were tight communities, shaped by family loyalty and old country traditions. But they were also places where legitimate life brushed up against the shadows of bookmaking operations and smoky back rooms. Social clubs lined certain streets like unmarked churches, their doors always unlocked but never wide open. Inside, men spoke in voices that barely rose above whispers. These weren't places for children, but everyone knew they existed. And young Vincent knew that stepping too close to them brought a strange pull. Something dangerous, yet strangely familiar, like hearing a story you already knew the ending to but couldn't stop listening to. He grew up watching the way men carried themselves as they walked in and out of those clubs. Their suits fit better than anyone else's in the neighborhood. Their cars sat low and polished against the curb. They never seemed rushed, never looked uncertain. never appeared at the mercy of the world around them. If life was a tide, these men looked like they stood above the water. For a boy who saw the struggles of ordinary families, the overdue bills, the exhaustion etched into his father's face, that confidence left a mark deeper than any sermon or lecture. In New Jersey, gambling wasn't explained to children, but it didn't need to be. It was in the air. Bookmakers operated from barbershops, back rooms, and even the corner tables at local diners. To most kids, it was just part of the scenery. To Vincent, it was a quiet education. He noticed how gamblers walked differently depending on whether they owed money or expected to collect. He noticed the coded language woven into conversations: teams, odds, spreads, numbers. Adults treated the vocabulary like a second dialect, one that only certain people were permitted to speak. But Vincent listened anyway. He wasn't trying to become anything yet. He was simply absorbing the rhythm of the neighborhood. His family was not wealthy. They lived modestly, careful with every dollar. His father worked long hours, and his mother carried herself with the kind of resilience common in immigrant families. Practical, tired, but unbreakable in a way only necessity can sculpt. Vincent understood early that ordinary life demanded sacrifices that left little room for dreams. And so he learned to keep his desires quiet, tucked in the same place. He kept his curiosity about the social clubs and the men who walked in and out of them. What set Vincent apart, even as a boy, was the way he paid attention. He read emotions like street signs. He could tell when an argument was about to break out long before anyone raised their voice. He sensed tension before it surfaced. In a neighborhood where peace could shatter quickly, that instinct became a kind of sixth sense, something that made him valuable long before he realized why. By the time he reached his late teens, Vincent blended easily into the rhythm of New Jersey life. He wasn't a troublemaker, nor was he someone anyone dismissed. He lived quietly, observed deeply, and spoke only when necessary. People noticed that about him, especially men who valued silence more than chatter. A quiet man doesn't reveal his thoughts. A quiet man absorbs your weaknesses. It was around this time that fate threaded him into a world he only observed from the edges. A world he hadn't chased, but one that often chose its members based on subtler qualities than ambition. The door opened through something as old as the Mafia itself: marriage. Vincent met a young woman named Anna Kutea, someone whose presence felt steadier than the chaos of the streets he grew up in. She carried herself with a confidence that suggested she came from a family where strength was inherited, not learned. Her uncle, Sam DeCavalcante, was already a powerful figure in New Jersey, a name that carried enough weight to silence conversations mid-sentence whenever it drifted through a room. Sam, known as the plumber, wasn't just a mob boss. He was the architect of the modern DeCavalcante crime family, the man who gave shape and discipline to an organization that once struggled to stand on its own beside the towering influence of the New York families. He was respected, feared, and quietly admired for his ability to turn New Jersey into a stronghold rather than a shadow of Manhattan's underworld. For Vincent, marrying Anna wasn't about power. It wasn't a strategic move or a calculated attempt to step into the Mafia's orbit. It was, at least at first, something remarkably ordinary: two young people choosing each other in a world full of uncertainties. But in the Mafia, nothing connected to blood or marriage is ever truly ordinary. Family ties are not just personal bonds. They are political currency. They shift alliances, open doors, and reshape destinies. When Vincent married Anna, doors opened for him that had remained sealed to outsiders. He suddenly found himself sitting at tables where jokes were whispered in half-sentences that didn't always feel like jokes. Men who once looked past him began acknowledging him with subtle nods, as if they now saw something in him they could work with. He was no longer just a quiet young man from Elizabeth. He was family to one of the most influential mob bosses on the East Coast. The transition didn't happen quickly. No one simply hands you trust in the Mafia. But the doorway was open, and Vincent had the temperament that fit the DeCavalcante world seamlessly. He didn't brag. He didn't rush. He didn't draw attention. He had the kind of calm presence that absorbs tension rather than creating it. In a life built on secrecy and control, that quality was worth more than muscle. As he became more integrated into Anna's extended family, he began learning the quiet rituals of mob life. Dinners where certain topics were avoided without needing to be announced. Meetings where every nod had a meaning. Conversations where the end of a sentence mattered less than the way it was spoken. He watched how Sam operated, deliberate, strategic, and restrained. There were no loud threats, no angry outbursts. Power moved through him like a slow, steady current. In that world, silence was not weakness. Silence was command. And Vincent, who had grown up mastering silence long before he understood its value, found himself fitting into the shadows with a natural ease that unsettled some and intrigued others. But as much as he blended into the environment, he also sensed the weight of the path unfolding beneath his feet. Immigrant neighborhoods often taught a simple lesson: family determines fate. But in his case, the lesson felt sharper, heavier, more dangerous. By marrying into the DeCavalcante bloodline, he wasn't just inheriting new relatives. He was inheriting expectations he didn't fully understand yet. Expectations that came wrapped in tradition, loyalty, and violence. Yet the most dangerous expectations are often the quiet ones, the ones never spoken aloud. Vincent sensed that his life was changing, but he couldn't yet grasp just how deep those changes would run. He saw respect growing around him like a shadow lengthening at sunset, subtle but impossible to ignore. He saw opportunities appearing in places where doors had once remained shut, but he also felt a shift inside himself, something darker, something sharper, something he couldn't name yet. He had always known how to survive, but now he was beginning to learn how to be useful. And usefulness, in the Mafia, is the first step toward a point of no return. As the years passed, the quiet young man from Brooklyn found himself slowly, almost imperceptibly, being drawn toward the center of a world he once admired only from afar. He stood at the threshold of something larger than he had ever imagined, a future built not on noise, but on calculated silence. A future where every decision, every relationship, every moment of hesitation carried consequences that could not be undone. The only thing he didn't know yet was how high the stakes would rise once he stepped fully inside. And the moment that would push him through that door was already on its way. The first real doorway Vincent Palermo ever walked through as an adult wasn't marked by gunfire or whispered threats. It was far quieter. It was the doorway into his new family's home, the house of the Cuteas, where relatives crowded the kitchen and everyone talked over the sound of boiling pots and televisions humming in the next room. It was supposed to be an ordinary visit, a simple dinner after he married Anna, but it carried an energy he couldn't fully name at the time. The men at that table didn't ask many questions. They didn't have to. Their silence did more measuring than words ever could, and Vincent felt it working its way over him with every passing minute. He didn't show it, but he was being studied and evaluated, weighed the same way a butcher weighs a piece of meat to see if it is worth the price. No one said the word Mafia. No one needed to. It was in the tone of their voices, in the half-smiles exchanged across the table, in the casual way they spoke about problems that sounded too large for ordinary men to solve. These men weren't loud. They weren't reckless. They were composed, polished, and precise, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. If fear was a storm, these men were the quiet calm that arrived moments before lightning struck. Vincent didn't realize it, but this dinner was his first test. He didn't talk too much. He didn't talk too little. He listened, nodded at the right times, kept his posture relaxed, and didn't force himself into any conversation. What he didn't understand, yet, was that the men around him interpreted silence as discipline, a rare and valuable trait. They didn't want someone eager or flashy. They wanted someone who knew how to watch without drawing attention, someone who didn't crumble under pressure, someone who didn't need to be the loudest person in the room because he already understood that real power rarely raises its voice. Over the months that followed, those dinners became more frequent. Each time he stepped into Anna's family home, he found himself surrounded by the same quiet authority. The Couteas carried themselves like men who had seen every scenario twice and feared none of them. The older ones leaned back in their chairs with an ease that came from decades of being obeyed. The younger ones mirrored that confidence, eager to show they had inherited the right demeanor, even if they had not yet earned the right responsibilities. Vincent learned to read them the way some men read maps. A twitch of an eyebrow meant someone was lying. A slow inhale meant someone was considering a threat. A downward glance meant someone was testing the waters before revealing something bigger. In that world, nothing was accidental. Every gesture was a signal. Every silence was a strategy. By then he was in his early 20s, working honest jobs, trying to build a stable life for himself and Anna. But stability in immigrant families often felt like trying to balance a heavy pot on a broken stove. One wrong movement, and everything toppled. Bills piled up, expenses rose, expectations from relatives increased, and the simple dream of being a dependable husband and father felt heavier than it should have. He never complained, but the weight pressed harder each week. On some nights, after long shifts, he sat awake wondering how men who worked harder than he did ever managed to survive. It was a question that lingered in the back of his mind before he married Anna. But now, watching how her family lived, comfortable, confident, untouched by the struggles that burdened everyone else, he felt the question transform into something sharper. How did men like them always seem to rise above the tide, while everyone else drowned beneath it? The answer, though never spoken aloud, was always present. Power had a way of lifting certain men out of the water, and power, in New Jersey, often came with a price. One evening, after a long dinner at the Couteas, Anna's uncle placed a hand on Vincent's shoulder as they stood near the door. It was not affectionate. It was measuring, the kind of gesture men used to test the backbone of another. He didn't ask Vincent how work was going. He didn't ask about his marriage. He asked a single, deceptively simple question, a question that felt like it carried layers beneath the surface. "You keeping busy?" Vincent nodded. "Trying to." The older man's eyes softened only slightly. "Good. A man who knows how to keep busy never starves." To anyone else, it might have sounded like casual advice. Vincent understood it differently. It was an opening, small, subtle, easily missed if you weren't paying attention. He didn't respond, didn't pry, but he didn't forget it either. Weeks later, another relative asked him if he wanted a little something on the side. Nothing big, nothing complicated, just helping out with deliveries, running small errands, things that seemed harmless. Vincent agreed, not out of greed, but out of practicality. A little extra money could take the edge off bills. It could give him the breathing room he needed as he and Anna built their life. The work came with no explanations. He didn't ask for any, and that silence built trust faster than any conversation ever could. The errands grew, the money increased, and the circles he moved in began shifting, slowly bringing him closer to the gravitational pull at the center of the DeCavalcante family. The underworld doesn't welcome men with red carpets. It draws them in through small obligations, small favors, small dependencies. A few dollars extra becomes a few hundred becomes a few thousand. And before you realize the shape of the path, you've already been walking on it for so long that turning back feels impossible. For Vincent, the shift happened gradually, but unmistakably. He started spending evenings at social clubs where men played cards under yellow lights and spoke in coded conversations. Money passed hands quietly. Drinks were poured without being ordered. The air felt heavy with unspoken rules, and Vincent obeyed them instinctively. He didn't laugh too loudly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to impress anyone. He blended into the environment like he had been part of it all his life. Some men in those rooms boasted about their connections or their toughness. Vincent understood that boasting was a luxury men afforded themselves before they learned better. The ones who survived long enough to be respected spoke less and listened more. He gravitated to those men, the ones with soft voices and hard eyes, the ones who didn't flinch when someone else raised their voice, because they didn't need noise to assert control. It wasn't long before someone asked if he wanted help with some numbers, Small-time bookmaking at first, little responsibilities that tested not only loyalty but temperament. Bookmaking wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something essential: the rhythm of risk. It was like watching a storm develop, understanding which way it would move, knowing when someone was desperate, when someone was lying, when someone might explode. A bookmaker, he learned, wasn't simply collecting bets. He was reading people. And Vincent was already good at that long before he realized it was a skill. The money was steady. The trust grew thicker. The invitations became more frequent. And now he was sitting at tables where men asked his opinion, even if only with a glance. He wasn't rising through the ranks. He wasn't aiming for anything. He was just doing what came naturally, being quiet, steady, and useful. In that world, usefulness was the most valuable currency. And he was earning it with every passing month. The more comfortable he became in these circles, the more he noticed the dual nature of the men around him. They were not movie villains, snarling and reckless. They were family men, fathers, uncles, men who prayed in church and handed out candy to neighborhood kids. But beneath that warmth lived something colder, a willingness to enforce respect with deadly precision if the situation demanded it. He learned early that a man could be tender toward his children and merciless toward his enemies without seeing any contradiction in it. He didn't judge any of them. He simply observed, and that observance turned into understanding. And that understanding turned into a quiet alignment, a natural leaning toward the men who moved through life with the certainty he had always admired from afar. Meanwhile, his relationship with Anna grew stronger. She was the only place in his life where he didn't have to measure his words. But even with her, he rarely spoke about the things he was starting to see, not because he wanted to hide them, but because he instinctively knew these were not words meant for the ears of someone who still believed the world was safe. What she sensed, however, was the subtle shift in him, a growing confidence, a quiet self-assurance that hadn't been there before. She didn't ask where it came from. She simply trusted him, the way women in tight-knit Italian families often trusted their husbands, believing that men handle burdens so the rest of the family didn't have to. As years passed, Vincent found himself becoming a fixture in certain rooms. Older men nodded at him with familiarity. Younger men moved out of the way when he approached. He didn't command a room. Not yet. But the room increasingly responded to his presence. And in Mafia circles, that shift never goes unnoticed. One night, as he sat in a club watching two men argue over money, he realized something profound. He was no longer standing on the fringes of this world. He had been slowly drawn into its center, drawn not by ambition, but by the gravitational pull of respect. He had become someone people relied on, someone they trusted to handle problems without drama, someone who could walk into a tense situation and pull it apart with nothing more than calm logic and an unreadable stare. In the Mafia, men like that were rare, and they were prized. But with every favor he did, every night he spent in those rooms, every whispered conversation that ended with someone patting him on the back, he stepped deeper into a life that did not allow retreat. And the older he grew, the more he realized that opportunity in the underworld always arrived disguised as obligation. What Vincent didn't know yet was that someone had already taken notice of him. Someone watching from the background, calculating his potential with the same quiet intensity Vincent used to read others. It wasn't a soldier or a capo, or even a distant relative. It was someone far more dangerous. Someone whose approval could change a man's life more suddenly than any marriage ever could. And the moment when that man finally called Vincent forward was closer than anyone realized. The tides were shifting around him. New Jersey was about to enter an era of power struggles, hidden alliances, and silent wars fought behind closed doors. And without ever seeking it, without even fully understanding it, Vincent Palermo was being pulled into the center of it all, toward a future where his quiet nature would become the sharpest weapon he ever carried. The next step in his evolution wasn't going to be a favor or an errand or a simple night at a social club. It was going to be something far heavier, far darker, and far more binding. And once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. Long before Vincent Palermo ever stepped into a social club, long before his name carried the weight it eventually would, New Jersey had already been etched with the quiet power of a crime family that the public barely knew existed. The DeCavalcante organization didn't announce itself the way New York's five families did. It didn't dominate front pages, or boast its influence, or run its streets with open swagger. It operated like a ghost, present everywhere, yet seen nowhere, shaping the underworld from the shadows with a control far more subtle than the mobs across the river. And that silence, that almost invisible presence, would become the perfect world for a man like Vincent to one day thrive in. But to understand how he would eventually rise, you first have to understand the world built before him. The roots of the DeCavalcante family stretched back to men who had crossed the ocean with little more than desperation and the belief that America could be bent to their will if they pressed hard enough. These men settled in New Jersey not because it was glamorous, but because it was overlooked. New York captured attention. New Jersey captured opportunity. It was the kind of place where criminal enterprise could grow quietly, like a vine creeping along the back of a house, unnoticed until it had already taken hold. In the 1950s, when the Mafia was becoming a national conversation, the DeCavalcante crew was still small, but it was organized. It had its own hierarchy, its own codes, and its own ambitions. It wasn't a satellite of the New York families, but it also wasn't strong enough to openly challenge them. It operated in the gray space between independence and imitation, trying to build something respected, but not yet feared. And then a man named Sam, the plumber, DeCavalcante, took control. Sam was not a traditional mob boss. He didn't bark orders or hide behind theatrics. He was, in some ways, the first quiet Don in New Jersey, a businessman who operated with the calm confidence of someone who understood exactly how much influence he had and how much more he could take if he moved carefully. Under his leadership, the family grew into a structured organization with rules, expectations, and an identity that set it apart from every other crime group in the region. He was called the plumber, partly because he operated a legitimate plumbing business, but also because he fixed problems quietly, swiftly, without leaving a mess behind. He cultivated relationships with politicians, businessmen, and union leaders, weaving a network so complex that even federal investigators struggled to map it. He made the family profitable not through violence, but through strategy. And that approach shaped the entire culture of the organization. In Sam's world, a man's intelligence mattered as much as his toughness. A calm mind was more valuable than a loud threat. And loyalty wasn't demanded. It was earned through respect. This philosophy seeped into every corner of the organization. The men who joined the DeCavalcantes learned quickly that they were expected to think before they acted, to observe before they spoke, and to value long-term gain over short-term ego. It was an environment built for men like Vincent, though he didn't know it yet. The qualities that would later elevate him, patience, quiet analysis, emotional control, were the same qualities Sam rewarded in the men he trusted most. The family expanded through gambling operations, labor union influence, construction rackets, and low-profile, but extremely profitable bookmaking networks. Unlike New York, where power was often asserted with spectacle, New Jersey's Mafia quietly burrowed into the economic structures that ordinary people depended on. If New York was the face of organized crime, New Jersey was its backbone. Invisible, essential, and always underestimated. By the 1960s, when Vincent was still a young man with more questions than answers about his future, the DeCavalcante family had become a force moving silently beneath the surface of everyday life. Bars, nightclubs, trucking companies, and construction sites all bore the fingerprints of men connected to Sam's world. Money flowed in steady streams, each drop adding to the growing reservoir of influence. But success never comes without threats. And the most dangerous threat the DeCavalcantes faced wasn't from law enforcement. It was from New York. The five families didn't appreciate competition, especially not from a smaller organization standing on the wrong side of the river. New Jersey was supposed to be a place where New York mobsters collected overflow profits, not a place where a local family could build its own empire. This tension created an invisible border between the states, one that shifted depending on alliances, rivalries, and the whims of powerful men. Sam understood that stepping too far into New York's territory would lead to conflict that could destroy everything he had built. So he played a careful game. He forged alliances with certain New York leaders, kept peace with others, and avoided antagonizing anyone whose anger could ignite a war. It was diplomacy done with handshakes instead of treaties, with subtle messages instead of announcements. This balancing act made the DeCavalcante family stable but cautious. The men inside the organization learned to operate with restraint. A wrong move could trigger consequences beyond New Jersey. Every decision required calculation. Every operation demanded approval. Nothing was done impulsively. For most men, that kind of environment bred frustration. But for someone like Vincent, raised in silence and observance, it was a blueprint waiting for the right hands. During the 1960s and 1970s, the DeCavalcantes continued to grow under Sam's leadership. What made the family unique was its proximity to New York combined with its refusal to be absorbed by it. It was a small kingdom standing in the shadow of a powerful empire, but it learned how to use that shadow to survive. When New York was under heavy investigation, New Jersey became a safer haven for certain operations. When New York families fracture internally, the DeCavalcantes stayed unified. It was a quiet rise, the kind of rise historians often overlook until years later, when they realize the subtlety was the power. Sam didn't seek fame. In fact, his preference for privacy became one of the family's greatest weapons. While New York bosses made headlines, Sam built foundations that lasted decades. While other leaders fell to indictments, betrayals, or assassinations, Sam navigated danger with calculated calm. But the same qualities that made him strong eventually drew unwanted attention. By the late 1960s, the FBI had begun to understand that New Jersey wasn't just a minor player. Surveillance increased. Investigations deepened. The more invisible the family tried to be, the more aggressively federal agents tried to reveal its inner workings. And like any underworld force, cracks began to appear under the weight of pressure. Some members grew reckless, chasing fast money and faster status. Others became entangled in personal feuds that threatened the stability Sam had created. Tensions with New York families simmered beneath the surface, sometimes erupting in ways that forced Sam to step in as mediator. His diplomacy skills were legendary, but even he couldn't control every variable. By the early 1970s, he sensed the walls tightening around him. The FBI had recorded conversations, mapped out hierarchies, and built enough evidence to threaten the foundation he had spent decades perfecting. Sam realized that stepping down, even temporarily, might be his only way to protect the organization. What he couldn't have known was that the vacuum created by his absence would set in motion a chain of events that shaped the future of the DeCavalcante family forever. With Sam imprisoned and leadership passing through temporary hands, the family entered a period of uncertainty. Power struggles emerged. Younger members wanted control. Older members wanted stability. New York families saw opportunity. The underworld shifted, like tectonic plates grinding slowly beneath the surface, each movement imperceptible until the earthquake arrived. These were the years when the family's identity was most vulnerable, and also the years when men like Vincent quietly learned who truly held influence, who cracked under pressure, and who had the ability to rise without making noise. While the DeCavalcantes maneuvered through leadership changes, mob alliances, and the pressure of investigations, Vincent was observing everything from the periphery. He wasn't part of the hierarchy yet, but he was close enough to feel the tremors each time the family shifted. He watched men he once admired crumble under the weight of paranoia. He saw others make reckless choices that cost them everything. And in that chaos, he recognized something important. Power belonged to the men who stayed calm when everyone else panicked. This realization shaped him more than any lesson spoken out loud. It became the silent rule at the center of his personality, guiding every decision he made in the years that followed. As the 1970s continued, law enforcement pressure intensified. Wiretaps, informants, surveillance operations. The walls were closing in on every Mafia family in America. But while New York families were being torn apart by high-profile arrests, the DeCavalcantes managed to remain standing. Not untouched, not invincible, but intact. And that resilience deepened their reputation as the silent family, the one that survived because it never exposed its throat to the enemy. However, silence can only protect a family for so long. Change was coming. A younger generation of mobsters was rising. Men who wanted money faster, status sooner, and recognition from the New York families that once ignored them. Ambition was growing like a fire that no one could fully control. And in the middle of this shifting landscape stood Vincent, no longer just a young man doing favors, but someone whose quiet manner had begun to draw subtle nods from influential men. He was the kind of figure older mobsters trusted instinctively, someone who did not seek attention, did not feed drama, and did not bring unnecessary heat. The hierarchy of the family was evolving. The old guard was aging. The middle tier was thinning due to arrests, and the younger generation was struggling to prove itself without losing the identity Sam had fought so hard to build. In that environment, a man like Vincent didn't need to climb. He simply needed to remain steady while others stumbled, and that steadiness made him increasingly valuable. A family that had survived by silence was naturally drawn to a man who embodied silence more purely than any of them. The DeCavalcante family didn't know it yet, but they were entering a new era, an era where subtlety would no longer be enough, where violence would force its way into decisions Sam once navigated with diplomacy, where alliances would shift faster than anyone could predict. And as pressure from law enforcement mounted, as New York families expanded their influence across the river, and as internal fractures widened, the family would soon look for someone capable of steering them through the chaos. Someone who could be trusted, someone who could be controlled, someone calm, someone capable, someone quiet. The rise that was coming would not be loud. It would not be celebrated. It would not be marked by ceremony. It would happen in silence, just like everything else in New Jersey's hidden underworld. And the man at the center of that rise, the man who would become the real Tony Soprano, the man the family would eventually lean on for stability, fear, and leadership, was already preparing himself without even knowing it. But before he could rise, before he could be trusted with responsibility, before he could become a major player inside the DeCavalcante world, he would first have to cross a threshold that no man could return from. A threshold marked not by opportunity, but by violence. And the moment that would force him to take that step was now drawing closer, tightening around him like a shadow he could no longer outrun. By the mid-1970s, the DeCavalcante family was living in two timelines at once. One was the legacy of the old guard, the disciplined, structured, almost understated empire Sam DeCavalcante had built. The other was the new reality forming in the shadows, a world of shifting alliances, unpredictable arrests, and younger mobsters hungry for fast money. These two worlds overlapped, collided, and blurred so often that even men inside the organization struggled to determine where the old rules ended and the new chaos began. And in that uncertain overlap stood Vincent Palermo, still a quiet presence in rooms filled with louder ambitions, still the man who listened while others boasted. But quietly, steadily, he was beginning to matter. It didn't start with a single moment. It never does. Power in the Mafia grows the way rust spreads across metal. Small, invisible at first, but eventually strong enough to reshape the entire structure. For Vincent, it began with the simplest thing of all, reliability. In a world of unpredictable men, he became the man who always showed up when he said he would. The man who never raised his voice. The man who didn't panic when others did. The man who kept problems quiet and handled them without turning a small inconvenience into a spectacle. That reliability didn't make him a boss. It didn't make him feared. but it made him indispensable. And in the underworld, indispensability is a currency far more valuable than fear. His earliest real responsibilities came from the unglamorous side of Mafia life. The business that kept the lights on, the wheels turning, and the money flowing. Illegal gambling, sports betting, loan sharking, card games, construction kickbacks. These operations didn't make newspaper headlines, but they kept envelopes full and hierarchy stable. And someone had to manage them. Someone had to keep the numbers straight. Someone had to make sure no one skimmed too much. Someone had to maintain calm when gamblers refused to pay or when tensions cracked between crews. Vincent handled these responsibilities with a kind of quiet precision that older mobsters respected immediately. He didn't get flustered when someone tried to negotiate too aggressively. He didn't let gamblers talk circles around him. He didn't provoke violence, but he didn't shy from it either. When someone needed reminding that debts were not optional, Vincent delivered the message without cruelty and without hesitation. He wasn't a sadist. He wasn't impulsive, but he was effective, and that effectiveness earned him more work. The first time he was trusted with a larger operation, he took over collections for a card game that had been bleeding money for months. The problem wasn't that the players refused to pay. It was that the man running the game, an older soldier with a drinking problem, kept losing track of who owed what. The books were a mess, the money was inconsistent, and the higher-ups were growing suspicious. They needed someone to clean the operation without embarrassing the man who had been loyal for decades. That someone was Vincent. He didn't confront the older soldier. He didn't point fingers. He simply reorganized the system, took charge of the books, tightened the schedule, and ensured every dollar was accounted for. The cash flow stabilized within weeks. The older soldier wasn't humiliated. No one lost face. And the higher-ups took note of the way Vincent preserved loyalty without sacrificing efficiency. It was a small job, but small jobs are how reputations are built. Soon, he received more responsibilities, not because he asked, but because men in authority began gravitating toward the calm presence who never made anything harder than it needed to be. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear expensive suits, didn't show off jewelry, didn't try to look like a tough guy. He wore the same understated clothes, drove an ordinary car, and continued living in a quiet home with Anna and their children, blending into suburban life as naturally as breathing. If anyone in his neighborhood suspected he was involved in organized crime, they never said anything. He didn't fit the stereotype. He didn't wave money around. He didn't create drama. He was the type of man neighbors described as polite, quiet, almost forgettable. And that forgettability became his most effective disguise. As his responsibilities expanded, so did his confidence. Not arrogance, confidence. A slow, simmering awareness that he could handle more than the men around him expected. He saw how some mobsters grew reckless with money, wasting it on cars, women, and nights they could barely remember. He saw how others let ego destroy decades of trust. And watching these mistakes, he learned. He became the type of earner bosses dream about. Consistent, discreet, intelligent, and loyal. By the late 1970s, when the DeCavalcante family entered another period of leadership instability, Vincent's value only increased. Factions formed. Crews shifted alliances. Men watched each other more closely. And in the middle of all the suspicion stood Vincent, a man who appeared to have no agenda, no ambition, no hunger for a higher seat at the table. That neutrality made him even more trusted. Men on both sides of internal disagreements relied on him, seeing him as safe ground, someone who would not betray them, someone who would not exploit their weaknesses. But neutrality is rarely permanent in the Mafia. It is simply the waiting area before fate pushes you onto one side or the other. In 1979, Vincent inherited a strip club that needed new management. At least, that was how the opportunity was framed. In reality, the club was a nexus for cash, politics, and influence, a place where deals were made, disputes were settled, and money moved through the hands of men who never appeared on paper. Taking over that club was not a small task. It was a test, disguised as a business venture. A test to management. A test of loyalty. A test of whether Vincent could navigate the unseen dangers woven into the walls of a place where allies and enemies shared the same bar stools. He didn't just run the club. He transformed it. He reorganized schedules, tightened security, cut out unreliable employees, and increased profits without drawing attention. The club quickly became one of the most stable revenue streams in the family. And that success opened doors that had been closed to him before. Older capos began requesting him for meetings. Disputes were quietly redirected to him for resolution. He handled these moments with the same calm he had shown as a young man learning the ropes, reading faces, interpreting silences, knowing when to press and when to withdraw. He understood something that many mobsters never learned. That violence was the last tool, not the first. Violence brought heat. Violence created witnesses. Violence destabilized families. Men who relied on violence too often exposed their own weaknesses, their ego, their fear, their insecurity. Vincent, on the other hand, mastered the art of pressure without explosion. He knew how to make a man pay a debt without breaking his bones. He knew how to enforce respect without raising his voice. He knew how to negotiate outcomes that left both parties respecting him rather than fearing him. His ability to keep the peace made him invaluable. But peace never lasts forever. The early 1980s brought new pressures. Federal investigations intensified across the country, targeting every Mafia family from New York to Chicago. The Commission case, which crippled the 5 families, sent shockwaves through New Jersey as well. Men were arrested, flipped, and disappeared. Suddenly, every conversation carried a weight of paranoia. Every meeting felt fragile. Every dollar earned came with the question of who might be watching. In that environment, chaos spread through organized crime like an infection. Some men cracked, betraying the very people who raised them. Others fled, leaving behind debts and unfinished obligations. And yet, in the midst of that instability, Vincent remained steady, reliable, predictable in the ways that mattered most. Bosses noticed. Capos noticed. Even men from New York noticed. The Genovese family, which often worked closely with the DeCavalcantes, began speaking of him quietly, as if acknowledging a future that was not yet written but increasingly obvious. He had become something rare, a man everyone could count on, a man who didn't panic, a man whose silence wasn't emptiness but calculation. But every rise comes with a price, and the first cracks in Vincent's quiet ascent appeared through something simple: money. As his responsibilities grew, so did the envelopes he delivered and received. Some weeks, the cash felt endless, a river flowing through his hands, shaping his life in ways that ordinary work never could. And with that money came a realization he had tried to ignore for years. The line between living quietly and living criminally had long since vanished. He was no longer a man doing favors. He was no longer part-time, no longer peripheral. He was in, all the way in. If law enforcement ever started looking his direction, he knew the consequences would be severe. He wasn't a soldier, officially. He was a maid. But he was involved deeply enough that the law would not distinguish him from the men who carried titles. And the deeper he went, the more he realized that stepping back was not an option. The Mafia doesn't allow resignations. It only offers endings. Around this time, whispers began circulating through the family. Whispers about a murder that needed to be done. A problem no one could fix through diplomacy. A man who had become a liability. A man suspected of cooperating with federal authorities. The name didn't matter yet. The act did. Because the moment Vincent heard those whispers, he understood that this was the threshold every man in the underworld eventually faced. There are 2 lives in organized crime: the life before your first act of violence, and a life after. And the men discussing the potential hit were not speaking hypothetically. They were searching for someone capable, someone calm, someone quiet, someone who would not ask questions, someone who would not leave a mess behind. Someone who could be trusted with a task that would bind him to the family forever. For years, Vincent had risen through silence, through patience, through restraint. But now, the family needed something more from him. Something darker. Something that would change everything about who he was and who he could ever be. The request had not yet reached him formally. It was still just a shadow in the room, a suggestion moving from table to table. But the shadow was moving closer. And when it finally reached him, it would not ask for permission. It would demand loyalty in its purest, most irreversible form. The quiet man who had become a steady earner was about to be asked to prove something far heavier than discipline or intelligence. He was about to be asked to prove blood. And the moment that demand arrived, the moment that would define the rest of his life, was now creeping toward him on silent feet. By the late 1980s, the air in New Jersey felt heavier than it had in decades. It wasn't just the pressure of law enforcement or the constant surveillance that followed every step the Mafia took. It was something more internal, something quieter, something that crawled beneath the skin of the DeCavalcante family members like a whispered warning. The rules were changing. The old world of diplomacy was cracking. Rumors moved through bars, social clubs, and construction lots like cold wind, telling stories of men flipping, deals breaking, loyalties faltering. And through all of this, Vincent Palermo remained steady, calm, reliable, the same quiet presence he had always been. But everyone knew the world was shifting, and when a world shifts, it always drags the quietest men into the loudest storms. The trouble began with a businessman named Fred Weiss. To outsiders, Weiss was a polished figure, a man of newspapers and investments, someone whose life existed far above the grime of organized crime. But those who understood New Jersey's underbelly knew the truth. Weiss had done business with the DeCavalcantes, made money with them, stood close enough to benefit from the shadows without ever fully stepping into them. And now, he was under federal investigation. Worse, the feds believed he was talking. Cooperation was the deadliest word in the Mafia vocabulary. It didn't matter how long a man had been loyal. It didn't matter how many envelopes he had handed over, how many dinners he had attended, how many congratulations he'd offered at weddings or christenings. If a man spoke to the government, if he shared even a sliver of information, he became a threat large enough to tear down an entire family. And once a threat reached a certain size, there was only one solution. In 1989, the bosses decided that solution was Weiss's death. The meeting where his fate was sealed wasn't loud, dramatic, or emotional. It was a quiet gathering in a back room, men sitting around a table with their hands folded, their expressions unreadable. Someone mentioned the investigation. Someone mentioned the rumors. Someone mentioned the stakes. And by the time the conversation ended, they all knew what needed to be done. It wasn't personal. It wasn't revenge. It was preservation, the coldest kind. The decision filtered down through the ranks like water dripping through cracked stone. By the time it reached the men who would execute it, the command had taken on the same emotionless tone as an instruction to pick up groceries or deliver a package. That's how the Mafia survived, by turning life-and-death choices into routine tasks. But when that order neared Vincent, something in the air around him changed. He could feel it before anyone said a word. The looks lingered a little longer. The conversations around him grew shorter, sharper. Men who normally joked or exchanged quick greetings nodded at him with a heaviness he couldn't ignore. There is a certain stillness that enters a room when someone is about to be asked to cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. And that stillness had begun following him like a shadow. One evening, a man he respected, a man who had observed Vincent's reliability for years, asked if he could speak privately. They stepped into a quiet corridor behind a club, the door shutting out the noise of laughter, music, and drinks. The man's voice was calm, steady, stripped of any unnecessary detail. He didn't explain the investigation. He didn't list the risks. He simply said that a problem needed to be addressed, and the family needed someone they could trust to handle it. Vincent didn't answer immediately. He just nodded, the same way he had nodded at 100 small requests over the years. But this was not another envelope, not another bookkeeping task, not another negotiation with gamblers. This was the door every man knew he might someday be asked to walk through. He didn't ask why him. He didn't ask if someone else could do it. He didn't ask for details or justification. Asking questions would have shown hesitation. And hesitation, even a flicker of it, could be misinterpreted as disloyalty. So he stood there, his face unreadable, and said nothing. The silence was taken as acceptance. That was the moment he crossed an invisible threshold, the kind no ceremony, oath, or handshake could ever compare to. Every man in the Mafia knows that the first act of violence binds you deeper than any allegiance spoken aloud. Violence is the point of no return. The setup for the killing was not cinematic. It was procedural. Weiss was followed. His routines were studied. His vulnerabilities mapped. There was no rush, no reckless improvisation. When a family planned a hit, they planned it with the same care a surgeon uses when marking incisions. The goal was clean execution, no witnesses, no uncertainty. And that meant Vincent had to be calm, steady, and precise. In the days leading up to the hit, he moved through his life with the same quiet demeanor as always. He kissed his children goodnight. He kissed his wife good morning. He went to the club, made collections, handled business. To anyone watching, he seemed unchanged. But inside, something had shifted, a weight settling in his chest, not of fear, but of inevitability. He understood what this meant. Once he did this, he would no longer be the quiet earner with a careful, measured record. He would be something else, something the family valued even more. The night before the hit, Vincent sat alone in his car after finishing business. He watched the lights of a street lamp flicker across the windshield, forming shapes that moved like restless ghosts. He wasn't thinking about the act itself. Men like him rarely fixated on the violent moment. What weighed on him more was what the act symbolized, a declaration that he belonged fully to a world that demanded blood as proof of loyalty. The next day arrived without ceremony. Weiss appeared exactly where the family predicted he would, walking toward his vehicle in the dim morning light. He was alone, unaware that the final seconds of his life were unfolding with the cold precision of a script written long before he stepped outside. The hit team approached. There were no warnings, no dramatic confrontations, just the sudden eruption of violence, a flurry of gunfire that cut through the quiet like thunder in a church. Weiss didn't speak a final word. His body collapsed against the morning pavement, and the killers disappeared before the echo of the shots faded. It was quick, controlled, efficient. Later, investigators would examine his death from every possible angle. They would trace connections, scrutinize business dealings, interrogate associates. They would conclude what the DeCavalcantes already knew. Weiss died because he was a liability, because he stood too close to the government, because in a world built on silence, he had become a potential source of noise. But on the day it happened, Vincent didn't celebrate or react. He didn't express pride or fear or even relief. He returned home, washed his hands, and went about his day as if nothing unusual had happened. To outsiders, that stoicism might have seemed cold. But in the Mafia, emotional control is a survival skill. And for Vincent, silence was his strongest instinct. However, the impact of the killing did not stay quiet for long. Inside the family, the hit sent a message. Vincent could be trusted with serious tasks. He was not just an earner anymore. He had proven he could handle the weight of responsibility that came with violence. And that shifted how the hierarchy viewed him. Men who once saw him as a helpful presence began regarding him with deeper respect. Some nodded at him differently, with a subtle acknowledgement reserved for men who had crossed certain lines. Others began involving him in conversations that once excluded him. He didn't ask for promotion. He didn't change his demeanor. But the world around him shifted anyway. Violence, in the Mafia, does not elevate a man because it shows cruelty. It elevates him because it shows commitment. And commitment, in its purest form, is what Vincent had now proven. Still, the killing did not close the Weiss investigation. It intensified it. The feds dug deeper. They tracked every associate. They scrutinized the DeCavalcantes with renewed aggression. Surveillance increased. Informants were approached. And while the family tightened its operations, the pressure became impossible to ignore. In the years that followed, the Weiss murder remained a point of scrutiny, a ghost that lingered over the DeCavalcante family, waiting for the day someone would speak out. In the Mafia, secrets are kept through fear, loyalty, and silence. But federal pressure can crack even the strongest bonds. Inside the family, the balance of power shifted. Leadership changed hands. Older men stepped back. Younger men stepped forward. And through it all, Vincent continued to rise. He didn't need to fight for authority. Authority flowed to him naturally, drawn by his calm, his intelligence, and his proven loyalty. But every rise comes with shadows. And every shadow eventually reveals the dangers hiding within it. The killing of Weiss had been a turning point for Vincent. But it was also the first step on a path that would lead him deeper into the heart of the organization. A place where loyalty became more demanding, power became more dangerous, and every choice carried consequences he could not yet imagine. The family saw potential in him. Potential to lead. Potential to keep the organization stable. Potential to survive the storms that were beginning to form on the horizon. But before any of that could happen, before titles could be considered, before responsibilities could grow even heavier, the DeCavalcante family would face a crisis so large, so destabilizing, that it would reshape every corner of their world. And when that crisis arrived, the quiet man they once overlooked would find himself standing at the very center of the storm. The place where power is earned not by silence alone, but by the choices that silence forces a man to make. By the start of the 1990s, the DeCavalcante crime family was caught in a strange contradiction, stronger than ever on the streets, but weaker than ever at the top. Money was flowing steadily. Construction rackets were profitable. Gambling operations remained reliable. Yet for all the visible strength, the foundation of the hierarchy had begun to rot. Arrests, indictments, betrayals, and federal pressure were chipping at the core of the organization. And when a family's core begins to crack, everything around it becomes vulnerable. The boss at the time, Giovanni, John the Eagle Riggi, had held authority with seriousness and discipline. He was a man who followed the old rules, a man who understood the delicate diplomacy required to keep New Jersey small, but determined family from being swallowed by the 5 families of New York. Riggi was respected, strategic, and careful. But none of those qualities mattered once the federal indictments began circling him like vultures. Law enforcement had been watching Riggi for years, waiting for an opening. And when they finally found it, they tore him from the street the way a storm rips a tree from the ground, violently, relentlessly, leaving everything around it shaken. His arrest sent tremors through the entire organization. Losing a boss is never clean. It creates a vacuum that sucks in fear, ambition, uncertainty, and betrayal. And in the Mafia, a vacuum is the most dangerous thing of all. The moment Riggi was taken into custody, everyone began asking the same question. Who would take the reins now? Who could keep the balance intact? Who could navigate the rising pressure from both law enforcement and New York? Who could stop the internal fractures from becoming open wounds? The DeCavalcante family had never been large enough to afford chaos. They needed a steady hand, a calm mind, someone who understood the difference between power and noise, someone who would not bring unnecessary heat. The old guard tried to maintain control. A succession plan was whispered. Temporary leadership arrangements were discussed. Capos met behind closed doors, their voices low, their eyes calculating. But every solution felt fragile, temporary, incomplete. The family was entering a period where tradition mattered less than adaptability, and adaptability was something the older hierarchy struggled to embrace. They were men built for a different era, an era before wiretaps recorded every careless word, before informants hid behind every smile, before federal investigators treated the Mafia like an engineering problem to be dismantled piece by piece. And as the old world fractured, a younger generation of mobsters sensed the shifting wind. They were ambitious, reckless, hungry for power. Some saw Riggi's downfall as their opportunity. Others saw it as a sign to lie low. And in the middle of all of this movement, quiet and steady, stood Vincent Palermo, a man who still didn't consider himself a contender, a man who believed he was simply doing the jobs he was asked to do. But fate has a way of choosing men long before they choose themselves. In the months following Ridgie's arrest, the family operated in a strange limbo. There was no official boss, only acting figures whose authority depended more on trust than title. Meetings were tense. Conversations were cautious. Every decision seemed to carry double its normal weight. And the federal government knew exactly what was happening. They increased surveillance. They leaned on informants. They watched the family scramble to maintain order, waiting for someone to make a mistake. In this fragile environment, Vincent's quiet stability became more noticeable than ever. He didn't panic like the younger members. He didn't scheme like the ambitious ones. He didn't cling to outdated methods like the older ones. He simply acted with the same calm precision that had carried him through every task before. And in a time of instability, calm becomes gravity, drawing everything toward it. One night, during a tense gathering in a dimly lit social club, the acting leaders ran through business issues that seemed more chaotic than usual. Money was delayed. A union contact had become unreliable. A construction deal was in danger of falling apart. And for the first time, the men at the table struggled to find agreement. Voices rose. Tempers flared. Accusations hung in the air like smoke. Then someone asked Vincent for his opinion. It was a small gesture, casual even, but the room fell strangely quiet afterward. He wasn't a capo, not officially. He wasn't part of the leadership circle. But the men looked to him anyway. He spoke calmly. He didn't criticize. He didn't point fingers. He simply dissected the problem with the same precision he once applied to card game collections and club management. He explained what needed to be done, who needed to handle it, and how to avoid unnecessary heat. When he finished, the room relaxed. Men nodded. Tension dissolved. The plan he laid out was accepted without argument. It was in that moment, subtle but undeniable, that the family began to see him not just as a capable earner, but as something more, someone who could lead without forcing leadership onto the room, someone who could guide without dominating, someone who could hold the organization together without stirring trouble. Yet even as his influence grew, Vincent stayed quiet. He never pushed himself forward. He never lobbied for authority. He never exploited the weakness of anyone above him. His restraint made him even more respected. But respect alone does not make a boss. Circumstance does. Pressure does. Crisis does. And the crisis arrived faster than anyone expected. Ridgie's imprisonment destabilized alliances the family had relied on for years. Certain captains saw opportunities to carve out their own domains. Younger members began making decisions without approval, risking backlash from both law enforcement and New York. The Genovese family, which had always kept a watchful eye on New Jersey, grew increasingly concerned about the DeCavalcante's vulnerability. And concern from a powerful ally is often just another word for potential intervention. The DeCavalcante family needed a leader. Not next year, not next month, but now. Someone who could unify the crews, keep New York satisfied, and maintain order during the storm. Someone with a reputation clean enough to be trusted, strong enough to be believed, and quiet enough to avoid unnecessary attention. In the end, the choice was not made in a dramatic meeting. It formed slowly, through countless small conversations, exchanged glances, and whispered agreements. Leadership in the Mafia rarely begins with an announcement. It begins with consensus, and the consensus began to settle on the man who had become the silent center of the family. By 1991, Vincent was serving as the de facto acting boss. The title was never officially stamped. It didn't need to be. Men came to him with problems. Men accepted his decisions. Men followed his guidance. In the Mafia, authority is not something a man claims. It's something others give him by trusting him more than anyone else. But stepping into leadership was not the reward outsiders imagine it to be. It didn't bring celebration. It didn't bring comfort. It brought weight, a weight heavier than any task he had been given before. As acting boss, Vincent found himself in rooms where decisions shaped the future of the organization. He navigated meetings with New York families, ensuring the DeCavalcantes didn't appear weak or disorganized. He balanced the ambitions of younger mobsters with the traditions valued by the older ones. He made sure money kept flowing, violence stayed controlled, and paranoia didn't spiral into self-destruction. He lived in quiet, calculated vigilance. One wrong move could fracture the family beyond repair. One careless conversation could lead to indictments. One misread enemy could start a war they couldn't win. Yet even under immense pressure, he stayed calm. If the room heated, he cooled it. If someone grew reckless, he steadied them. If a threat emerged, he addressed it with clear, controlled steps. His leadership style reflected the very philosophy Sam DeCavalcante had brought decades earlier. Diplomacy first, strategy second, force only when necessary. But times were changing, and diplomacy was not always enough. In the early 90s, law enforcement began using new tools against organized crime: advanced wiretaps, undercover operations, expansion of RICO laws. The Mafia was being cornered by systems far more complex than anything the older bosses had faced. And, as the pressure intensified, cracks began forming inside the family once again. Loyalty wavered. Fear grew. Men whispered about indictments like curses waiting to be spoken aloud. Vincent saw it all, and he understood something few others did. Leadership was not about being feared or being followed. It was about understanding what people hid behind their words and preparing for the moment those hidden fears would take over. Around this time, he began receiving warnings, subtle, casual, but unmistakably real, that law enforcement was preparing something big. Surveillance had increased. Strange cars appeared on familiar streets. Certain meetings suddenly felt watched. That sense of being observed, even from a distance, crept into the edges of Vincent's life like a shadow that wouldn't go away. He knew the feeling well. The walls were closing in. But he also knew something else, something he could not yet explain, even to himself. The family wasn't simply facing an external threat. There was tension brewing from within, a quiet discontent among certain members. Men who saw Vincent's quiet authority not as a strength, but as an obstacle to their ambitions. Some believed he was too calm, too understated, too unwilling to assert dominance through force. They wanted a louder boss, a man who commanded rooms with threats instead of logic, someone who matched the chaos of the era with the chaos inside themselves. And while they muttered in the shadows, Vincent prepared for the storms he sensed approaching, storms that would test not just his leadership, but the stability of the family itself. But the most dangerous storm of all was one he didn't see coming. A storm not born of ambition, or enemies, or even betrayal. A storm that arrived one quiet evening, with a simple message from a man he trusted, a message that would place Vincent Palermo at the center of a decision so large, so irreversible, that nothing in his life would ever be the same after it. Because the next move the family needed to make, the move that would define their future, required more than leadership. It required blood. When Vincent Palermo stepped into the role of de facto boss in the early 1990s, it didn't feel like a coronation. There was no ceremony, no gathering of capos offering pledges, no dramatic moment where he declared himself in charge. Leadership, for him, settled in a place the same way dawn climbs over a city. Slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed until the world is already bright. But that quiet rise masked the reality that Vincent's life was about to split cleanly into two halves. One half lived in the shadows, steering a crime family through federal pressure, internal fracturing, and the growing scrutiny of New York. The other half lived in a suburban home with trimmed grass, clean sidewalks, backyard barbecues, and neighbors who waved without knowing how close they were to the dark heart of New Jersey's underworld. Those two worlds didn't simply coexist. They collided in ways that shaped Vincent's myth, both inside the Mafia and far beyond it. He became the man who could order a sit-down at 4 in the afternoon and still make it home in time to kiss his children goodnight. A construction shakedown in Newark at noon, a quiet dinner with his wife at 7, a meeting with capos in a dimly lit club, then helping one of his kids with homework at the kitchen table, the smell of baked ziti filling the house. This dual existence made him feel untouchable. It also made him dangerous, because a man who can hide behind normalcy becomes difficult to predict. The rise of Vincent's suburban facade didn't happen by accident. It was strategic. He understood that attention is poison in organized crime. Loud mobsters, flashy mobsters, men who loved nightclubs and sports cars and grand entrances. They were the ones who caught the eye of investigators, the ones who drew headlines, the ones who grew sloppy because they believed they were larger than life. Vincent had no interest in being larger than life. He wanted to be invisible, and there was no better disguise than the image of a quiet family man. His home became a fortress of normalcy. A modest suburban street, a well-kept lawn, a tidy driveway, children playing, relatives visiting, birthday parties with plastic plates, and backyard folding tables. Nothing about his house suggested power. Nothing suggested fear. If anything, Vincent seemed almost too ordinary, a man whose greatest ambition looked like raising a family in peace. Neighbors described him as polite, pleasant, quiet. A man who kept to himself, but never seemed unfriendly. If anyone thought he worked too little to afford what he had, they chalked it up to luck or smart business sense. No one imagined he ran a criminal empire from behind a smile that never rose too high. But inside the DeCavalcante family, that smile carried weight. When Vincent called a meeting, men showed up. When he offered an opinion, conversations shifted. When he gave an order, softly, calmly, without threat or theatrics, it was followed. The duality of his existence earned him a reputation that few mobsters achieved. He wasn't just the boss. He was the ghost boss. Present but unseen. Powerful but understated. Dangerous without needing to raise his voice. This balancing act required discipline few men possessed. Vincent didn't drink heavily. He didn't gamble recklessly. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. His life was built on control, and that control radiated through the family. Men knew that if they brought him a problem, he would solve it with clarity, not emotion. And when he listened to them, he listened fully, not for weakness, but for truth. That ability made him the kind of leader younger members admired instinctively, and older members trusted reluctantly, but undeniably. Still, being the boss, even unofficially, came with pressures that suburban walls couldn't shut out. Every day carried a new crisis. A union contact threatening to flip. A New York family pushing into New Jersey territory. A soldier making reckless choices instead of careful ones. A business owner dragging his feet on payments. The kind of problems that required finesse, strategy, and sometimes force. And Vincent switched between those roles the way most people switch from work clothes to pajamas. He also understood that leadership demanded visibility, even if he preferred invisibility. So he spent time in the clubs, checking in on the men, making sure no one felt ignored. He attended wakes, weddings, birthdays, the rituals that kept Mafia families glued together. And in each room, he moved like a man who carried no fear. His quiet nature, once mistaken for shyness, had become a weapon sharper than threat itself. When tensions rose between rival factions inside the family, Vincent stepped in not with intimidation, but with calm logic. He didn't shout. He didn't slam fists. He simply asked questions that exposed flaws in arguments. Most fights deflated before they had time to swell. It was this ability, more than anything else, that solidified his reputation as a stable leader, a man who could cool the temperature of a room simply by walking into it. But while the internal family dynamic stabilized under Vincent's guidance, federal pressure intensified year by year. Surveillance vans appeared near social clubs. Unmarked cars lingered in parking lots. Phones clicked at odd moments. Men whispered about indictments. Rumors spread of undercover agents moving through New Jersey's working-class communities like invisible threads woven into daily life. At night, in the quiet of his suburban home, Vincent sometimes felt the weight of those invisible threats. Sitting alone on the back porch, cigarette smoke drifting into the warm summer air, he would listen for the subtle hum of unmarked engines, the metallic rustle of men adjusting equipment in the dark. The paranoia was never loud. It was a low-grade hum beneath the surface of his calm exterior, a reminder that power always comes with shadow, and shadow always comes with watchers. Despite this, Vincent maintained routines that reinforced his disguise. He drove his kids to activities. He took his wife to dinner. He visited relatives, attended gatherings, volunteered in small ways that made him seem utterly ordinary. He understood that normalcy wasn't just a mask, it was a shield that made law enforcement underestimate him, and made rival families dismiss him as too quiet to be a real threat. This dual identity, ruthless boss in the shadows, gentle suburban father in the light, became the core of his myth long before Hollywood ever imagined Tony Soprano. But unlike fictional mobsters, Vincent didn't crave recognition. If anything, recognition terrified him. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be untraceable. And for years, he succeeded. By the mid-1990s, he had become one of the most influential figures in the New Jersey underworld. Yet only a handful of people outside the Mafia even knew his name. His power grew not through dramatic violence, but through strategy. He turned small operations into stable revenue streams. He resolved disputes before they escalated. He maintained relationships with New York families through steady diplomacy. He knew how to show respect without appearing weak, and how to assert authority without appearing hostile. But even as he built stability, cracks began to form around him. Cracks caused not by him, but by the world shifting faster than the old rules could bend. One of the biggest shifts came from within the family itself. Younger soldiers, raised in a generation shaped by greed rather than tradition, began pushing for faster money. They saw the flash of the Gambinos and the swagger of the Colombos and wanted the same. They didn't understand the careful diplomacy the DeCavalcantes relied on. They didn't respect the subtleties Vincent valued. They wanted noise, not silence. Power, not patience. And their recklessness began attracting attention that Vincent had spent years avoiding. Some started running unauthorized schemes. Others skimmed from envelopes. A few behaved so loudly that even civilians began to notice them. These weren't just annoyances. They were threats, the kind of threats that could draw investigators, start feuds, or spark violence between crews. Vincent dealt with them the same way he dealt with every crisis, calmly, methodically, without letting emotion cloud judgment. Sometimes he used warnings. Sometimes he used pressure. And sometimes, when the risk was too great, he used the final option, violence cast like a stone into deep water, leaving no ripple. His ability to control these fracturing elements kept the family stable. But stability disguised something much more dangerous. The feds had begun studying him. Quiet leaders aren't invisible to the government. They are magnets for investigators trained to recognize that true power rarely shouts. Rumors began circulating that federal agents were referring to him as the Quiet Dawn, long before the nickname caught on inside the underworld. Still, Vincent continued to move through life with confidence, trusting that his suburban camouflage gave him an advantage. What he didn't realize was that the very normalcy he relied on was beginning to crack. His quiet leadership made him indispensable. His growing influence made him visible. And visibility, no matter how subtle, attracts the wrong eyes. Around this time, a different kind of threat emerged, something he could neither outthink nor outmaneuver, a cultural shift he never saw coming. In 1999, HBO premiered The Sopranos, a series centered on a New Jersey mob boss juggling suburban life with mafia obligations. The resemblance between fiction and Vincent's real life was eerie. Too eerie. The DeCavalcante family members themselves began watching the show, stunned by how closely it mirrored their world. The backyard barbecues, the union rackets, the quiet leadership, the suburban home, the stress, the secrecy, the duality. It was all there. And men who once joked lightly now whispered nervously. Someone they believed had been talking. And those whispers traveled through the family with increasing suspicion, casting shadows even where none should have existed. If the show knew so much, what else might the world soon learn? Inside the organization, paranoia grew like mold. Men questioned each other. Men questioned themselves. Even Vincent, who had survived his rise by staying calm, felt the pressure. A fictional show had turned their invisible world into a national spectacle. And for the first time, Vincent's greatest strength, his ability to stay hidden, began slipping through his fingers. At first, he brushed off the comparisons. Television was fiction. His life was real. But as the episodes aired, and as his men whispered behind closed doors, he sensed a shift. People were looking at him differently. Not with suspicion, but with recognition. The kind of recognition he never wanted. It wasn't law enforcement that made him uneasy. It wasn't rival families. It wasn't even his own men. It was the simple, terrifying idea that the world had accidentally begun telling his story, a story meant to remain buried under layers of silence. As The Sopranos gained momentum, drawing millions of viewers, the DeCavalcantes grew increasingly paranoid. And paranoia, in a world built on secrecy, becomes the first crack in the foundation. Vincent tried to ignore it, to focus on business, to maintain order. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. Fiction had collided with his reality, and the collision had drawn eyes to New Jersey. Eyes that would soon turn into surveillance cameras, informant reports, federal files, and investigations more aggressive than anything the family had faced before. And as the world watched a fictional boss on television, the real one, the quiet one, the unexpected one, sat in his suburban home, unaware that the walls around him had already begun to close in. Because while television was turning his life into a story, the federal government was preparing to turn that story into evidence. And the next move would come not from Hollywood, but from a room filled with agents, listening to voices recorded in secret, voices that would soon threaten to destroy everything Vincent thought he could control. Inside the DeCavalcante family, power didn't announce itself with noise. It moved in whispers, exchanged glances, small gestures, and the kind of silence that said everything without revealing anything at all. And in the early and mid-1990s, when Vincent Palermo quietly held the reins of leadership, the culture inside the organization shifted into a strange mix of old-world codes and new-world risks. The family wasn't the same machine it had been under Sam DeCavalcante, nor the rigid hierarchy that Giovanni Ricci tried to maintain. It had become something else, a delicate ecosystem where survival depended on instinct as much as strategy, and where Vincent's quiet influence became the glue holding everything together. To understand life inside the family during these years, you have to understand how everyone fit into a structure that was both tightly controlled and constantly unstable. At the top sat a boss, in name, still Ricci, who was locked away, but not fully removed from power. Beneath him sat Vincent, the acting force, the man everyone looked to for decisions whether they said it out loud or not. Then came the capos, each running their own crew like small kingdoms that shared a border. Beneath them were soldiers, the backbone of every operation. And beneath the soldiers were associates, men not yet sworn into the life but still deeply entangled in its obligations. What made this ecosystem unique was how each level breathed differently depending on the day. Some days capos made choices. Other days Vincent overruled them with a single sentence. Some days soldiers followed orders. Other days they improvised based on instinct and fear. The hierarchy existed, but it didn't operate in a straight line. It twisted and bent depending on who was watching, who was talking, and who was under pressure. Vincent had learned early that controlling a Mafia family wasn't about issuing orders. It was about controlling the temperature, keeping the room cool enough that no one boiled over, but warm enough that no one froze into inaction. And that temperature control became his signature as a leader. He didn't demand loyalty. He created an environment where loyalty became the only logical choice. Men followed him because following him felt safer than following anyone else. Yet safety didn't mean peace. Violence existed behind every corner, not because Vincent encouraged it, but because the world around him demanded it in ways no calm attitude could erase. Every business the family controlled, whether gambling, construction, sanitation, strip clubs, or loan sharking, carried with it a layer of danger that couldn't be separated from the profit. Every dollar earned in the shadows required someone, somewhere, to feel pressure. And pressure, when not handled carefully, cracked into violence. One of the operations that defined this era was the union racket, particularly the carpenters and laborers' unions, which controlled massive construction projects across New Jersey and parts of New York. Through these unions, the DeCavalcantes had their hands on everything from skyscraper contracts to small renovation jobs. Money flowed in through no-show jobs, padded invoices, kickback schemes, and threats disguised as negotiations. A developer who didn't pay quietly found his site flooded with delays, missing equipment, or inspectors who suddenly discovered faults that weren't there a week earlier. This was not the kind of business outsiders imagined when they picture mafia violence. Most of it happened in office rooms, coffee shops, or construction trailers. A raised eyebrow here, a subtle warning there, a reminder that it would be best for everyone if cooperation continued. Violence was used only when a man refused to understand the language of implication. And when that happened, it was carried out quietly, because drawing attention was never part of the business model. Vincent oversaw these operations with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything. He didn't micromanage. He let the capos run their crews. But he stepped in when something began attracting heat. If a foreman complained too loudly, Vincent addressed it. If a union leader grew too greedy, he adjusted the flow of money. If a soldier got careless, he corrected the behavior, sometimes with only a look, sometimes with something much heavier. Another major revenue stream was illegal gambling, sports betting, card games, and underground casinos tucked behind legitimate businesses. These setups required constant monitoring. Some players were harmless degenerates who lost money weekly. Others were sharks who moved between families, testing boundaries, trying to find weaknesses. And then there were the addicts, people who spiraled into debts they couldn't pay, forcing the family to decide between mercy and a message. Vincent was known for patience, but patience didn't mean softness. If a man owed money, Vincent first looked at the situation logically. Was the debt unpayable? Was the man lying? Was he gambling behind his wife's back? Was he stealing to stay afloat? The answers shaped the response. Sometimes Vincent allowed extended timelines. Sometimes he lowered the interest to prevent the man from sinking too deep. But if he detected disrespect, the kind of disrespect that threatened the stability of the operation, the consequences became sharp and immediate. The family also maintained influence over nightclubs and strip bars, where cash flowed fast, untraceable, and without much oversight. Vincent had a natural talent for running these businesses because they required a balance between intimidation and charm. Club owners needed to feel protected, not suffocated. Employees needed to feel watched, not afraid. Customers needed to feel unsafe enough to pay, but comfortable enough to return. It was a delicate dance, the kind of dance Vincent's quiet nature allowed him to perform almost effortlessly. Yet the heart of life inside the family wasn't just business. It was loyalty, the kind of loyalty that wrapped itself around every man like rope. Some ropes held firm, others frayed under pressure. And when a rope snapped, it could bring down everything attached to it. Vincent understood the psychology of loyalty better than most. He knew that loyalty wasn't simply obedience. It was trust layered on top of fear, layered on top of history, layered on top of shared silence. Men stayed loyal because betrayal meant death. But men also stayed loyal because they felt seen, valued, and understood. Vincent offered that kind of environment. He listened to his soldiers' concerns, offered advice when needed, intervened in their personal conflicts if it protected the family. He didn't bark orders. He didn't belittle. His authority came from how he carried himself, not how loudly he demanded respect. Still, not everyone fit comfortably under his leadership. Some men craved louder bosses, bosses who ruled through intimidation and spectacle. They mistook Vincent's calm for weakness. They whispered in the shadows that he didn't have the heart for violence. They believed the family needed someone more ferocious, someone who matched the flamboyance of the New York families. Those whispers grew louder as The Sopranos gained popularity, because men who lived in a world shaped by fiction forgot the reality of their own world. A reality far more fragile and dangerous. Tensions escalated when certain soldiers began pushing boundaries, trying to carve out side operations for personal profit. Others grew impatient with Vincent's preference for diplomacy over immediate retaliation. They wanted chaos. They wanted noise. They wanted to feel like mobsters, not businessmen. And that desire for spectacle, one that Vincent had spent his entire career avoiding, threatened the stability of the organization. As these internal pressures grew, so did the threat from law enforcement. The feds had spent years studying the DeCavalcante family from a distance, but now they were focusing on the inner dynamics of the organization. They targeted soldiers, pressured bookkeepers, bribed low-level associates, and dug into businesses that looked too stable to be legitimate. They were hunting for cracks, any crack that would give them leverage, and cracks were forming faster than Vincent could seal them. One of the greatest challenges came from meetings with the Genovese family. New York's influence loomed large over New Jersey, and the Genovese family had always maintained an interest in the DeCavalcante's operations. They respected Vincent, but they also questioned whether New Jersey could hold itself together under mounting federal pressure. Any sign of weakness could lead to New York attempting to absorb certain territories or operations. And while Vincent could negotiate with diplomacy, he couldn't change the reality. The DeCavalcantes were vulnerable. Pressure intensified when a rumor began spreading that a union contact, someone central to multiple construction deals, was considering cooperation with the feds. The rumor wasn't confirmed, but the fear was enough to send shockwaves through the family. If a single union official flipped, entire revenue streams could collapse. Names could be exposed. Deals could unravel. Prison could become inevitable. Vincent handled the situation the only way he knew how, quietly and thoroughly. He investigated the rumor without alerting the potential informant. He spoke with trusted capos behind closed doors. He analyzed the man's behavior, the sudden change in his patterns, the way he avoided certain meetings. And slowly, a pattern became clear. The man wasn't just nervous. He was preparing for something drastic. While Vincent planned how to address the situation, more trouble emerged. A young soldier with more ambition than sense got into a fight at a club, drawing police attention that threatened to expose connections the family had spent years burying. Another associate skimmed money from gambling operations, forcing Vincent to intervene personally. And then, almost unbelievably, someone inside the family began bragging, in private conversations, but recklessly nonetheless, that they were the inspiration for characters on The Sopranos. Word of that bragging reached Manhattan. It reached New Jersey. It reached investigators. It even reached Vincent, who reacted with rare, simmering anger. Being inspired by a show was harmless. Claiming involvement was fatal. It attracted attention. The worst kind of attention. Vincent addressed that situation quickly. The man who bragged learned the hard way that silence wasn't a suggestion inside the DeCavalcante family. It was survival. The correction didn't require a body. It required fear. And the fear worked. But even as Vincent put out fires, the flames of federal surveillance grew larger. New technologies allowed investigators to monitor conversations with unprecedented clarity. Bugs appeared in places previously thought safe. In bars, in offices, in meeting spots, so carefully chosen that even Vincent's confidence began to waver. The feds were finding entrances into the family's world through cracks they didn't even know existed. And then, the moment that changed everything happened quietly, almost without warning. A conversation between two soldiers, a casual discussion about business, was recorded without their knowledge. It contained names. It contained instructions. It contained enough detail to make federal agents lean forward in their chairs. That recording was the first piece of a puzzle that investigators would soon assemble with frightening speed. Vincent didn't know it yet, but the walls were no longer just closing in. They were beginning to listen. And the voices the walls captured would soon lead to decisions that no amount of silence could undo. By the late 1990s, The DeCavalcante family was already struggling beneath layers of tension, paranoia, and pressure that seemed to thicken with every passing year. The feds were listening, the walls were narrowing, and Vincent Palermo was holding the family together with the same quiet control he had relied on since the beginning. But something unusual was brewing in the background, something no mobster had ever anticipated, something that didn't come from law enforcement, rival families, or internal betrayal. It came from a television show, and at first, it seemed harmless, almost laughable, until it wasn't. In 1999, HBO released a new drama about a New Jersey mob boss who juggled family life with the pressures of running a crime family. The man lived in the suburbs, had a wife and kids, paid his bills, attended therapy, and ran operations out of strip clubs and union halls. He lived quietly, strategically, without drawing unnecessary attention. His name was Tony Soprano. Inside the DeCavalcante family, the reaction began as mild amusement. Some men joked that Hollywood had finally noticed New Jersey. Others laughed at the idea of a mob boss going to therapy. The show seemed exaggerated, dramatized, just another fictional spin on the Mafia myth. Something to watch between card games, something to talk about over drinks. But as the weeks passed, the humor began to fade. The jokes softened, eyes narrowed, conversations grew cautious. Because the more episodes they watched, the more a strange unease began creeping through the organization. It wasn't just that The Sopranos was set in New Jersey. It wasn't just that the fictional boss lived the same suburban life many of them lived. It was the details, small, subtle, but unmistakably familiar. The strip club front, the construction rackets, the union deals, the backyard barbecues with men who acted like uncles but carried guns tucked beneath their shirts. The way Tony Soprano held meetings in quiet social clubs with cheap wood paneling and thick cigarette smoke. The way he moved through the world with calm, understated confidence. The similarities grew harder to ignore. Too hard. Too close. Men inside the DeCavalcante family began whispering to each other that this wasn't coincidence. Someone must have talked. Someone must have given details. Someone must have met with writers or producers. The paranoia that had been simmering beneath the organization for years suddenly erupted into something sharper. Watching the show began to feel like watching a mirror, one that reflected things they never wanted to see from the outside. And at the center of those comparisons stood Vincent Palermo. He didn't seek the attention. He didn't enjoy it. But he couldn't deny that the character of Tony Soprano looked eerily similar to the life he lived. The suburban home, the quiet authority, the strip club business, the ability to shift between fatherhood and leadership with a single breath. The calm demeanor masking a world of chaos beneath the surface. Men whispered behind his back, not out of disrespect, but out of disbelief. It didn't help that a few members of the family, reckless in their need to feel significant, began bragging that the writers were basing characters on them. Those whispers spread quickly through New Jersey's underworld, reaching men who didn't understand the line between fiction and danger. The more they talked, the more attention they risked drawing to themselves. Vincent hated the attention. He hated the comparisons. He hated the idea that a television show, no matter how fictional, could expose the atmosphere of their world with such uncanny accuracy. The more episodes aired, the more detail the show revealed. Details that felt too precise to be coincidence. And the FBI noticed. Investigators began watching the show with notebooks in hand, studying it the same way the mob studied surveillance patterns. They compared plots, analyzed storylines, and discussed whether the writers knew something more than they should. Some agents privately wondered whether the show's accuracy might lead to informants stepping forward out of fear of recognition. Others saw it as an opportunity, an unexpected tool that could shake confidence inside the DeCavalcantes and make men paranoid enough to slip. Vincent sensed the shift immediately. The show might have been fictional, but it created a new problem: exposure by implication. Even if it wasn't based on them, the public perception that it was could bring pressure they couldn't afford. And the worst part was that he couldn't control it. He couldn't threaten a film crew. He couldn't silence Hollywood. He couldn't handle the problem with money or fear. He could only watch as fiction crept closer and closer to the truth. During one gathering in a social club, a group of soldiers sat around a television watching an episode. Someone made a joke, a light-hearted comment about how Tony looked like Vincent. The others laughed, half nervously, half sincerely. For a moment, it felt harmless. But Vincent didn't laugh. He stood behind them for a few seconds, watching the screen. Tony Soprano sat at a barbecue table, flipping sausages on a grill, waving at neighbors, pretending his life was simple. Then he turned to his men with the calm authority that had become his signature. And in that flicker of silence, Vincent felt something in his chest tighten. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a recognition he wished he didn't feel, because even he couldn't deny it anymore. The resemblance was unsettling, too direct, too uncomfortable. He left the room quietly. The laughter behind him died out the second the door closed. As the Sopranos gained national fame, the DeCavalcante family's paranoia escalated. Every episode seemed to shine a spotlight on operations that felt eerily similar to their own. The tension inside the organization grew thick enough to taste. Some men began questioning each other. Others questioned themselves. If the show revealed more, a character with too much resemblance, a storyline mimicking real events, it could attract dangerous levels of attention. Vincent tried to calm the men, but even he couldn't reassure them fully. He was already carrying the weight of leadership, law enforcement pressure, internal disputes, and the constant threat of informants. Now he had to contend with a fictional world that was beginning to tear at the threads of his real one. The show also created a cultural shift Vincent couldn't control. Suddenly, people in New Jersey saw mobsters everywhere. Every Italian man in a nice car became a suspect. Every suburban family barbecue felt like a scene from television. The public had been given a fantasy, and they projected it onto everything. And while that fascination entertained civilians, it made the mob's camouflage thinner, harder to maintain, riskier to rely on. One episode hit particularly close to home. It described a mob boss dealing with internal betrayal, secret wiretaps, and unexpected vulnerability. Vincent watched it alone, the glow of the television casting faint shadows on the walls of his living room. His family had already gone to bed. He sat motionless, listening to the dialogue with a sinking feeling settling deep in his chest. Because fiction wasn't just reflecting his world anymore, it was predicting it. Throughout 1998 and 1999, the DeCavalcante family's unease shifted into full paranoia. And paranoia led to mistakes. Men spoke in hushed tones. Meetings were held in new locations. Suspicion hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Some capos demanded more secrecy. Others demanded more violence. Everyone demanded answers. But no one, not even Vincent, could answer a question no one dared to ask out loud. Who told them? On one quiet evening, a high-ranking member approached Vincent privately. His voice low, almost trembling, he said, "They know too much. Someone's feeding them something." Vincent stared at him without blinking. "It's a show," he said quietly. "Writers make things up." But the man shook his head. "Not this much." That sentence stayed with Vincent long after the conversation ended. He didn't believe someone from the family had spoken to the writers, but doubt doesn't need proof to grow. All it needs is a crack. And fiction had created that crack. As the year closed, an unexpected consequence of the show took hold. The Sopranos made New Jersey mobsters feel self-conscious. The men became aware of how they looked to the outside world. Some began copying the actors. Some even tried speaking like the characters. There were reports of soldiers mimicking lines, referencing episodes, comparing their lives to the show. It was embarrassing and dangerous, because men who imitate fiction become careless. Men who see themselves as characters forget the real stakes. And men who believe the world is watching perform instead of calculating. That shift, this strange creeping influence of Hollywood, began eroding the very culture Vincent had worked to maintain. He kept his distance from the show. He didn't want to acknowledge it. But even ignoring it didn't stop the consequences. Because while the fictional Tony Soprano thrived on screen, the real underworld was beginning to crack. The paranoia the show instilled made some men too cautious and others too bold. It drew attention, both from civilians and investigators. It destabilized loyalty, and it created a sense of inevitability, like the story was already written, and they were being dragged toward its ending whether they wanted it or not. Vincent sensed the shift like a chill moving across the back of his neck. The real danger wasn't the show itself. It was what the show awakened inside the family. Awareness, fear, self-doubt. And those feelings became the perfect conditions for the next phase of the federal investigation. A phase far more dangerous than anything that had come before. Because while the DeCavalcantes obsessed over a television show, the FBI had quietly begun listening to their real conversations. Wiretaps, hidden cameras, undercover operations. The walls weren't just watching anymore. They were recording. And the voices they captured would soon reveal secrets no fiction ever could. Secrets that would tear open the family from the inside. Secrets that would finally make the quiet man at the center of it all visible in the worst possible way. By the time the 1990s reached their last years, the DeCavalcante crime family was sleepwalking toward a disaster it couldn't yet see. The men inside the organization were preoccupied with rumors, television comparisons, internal jealousy, and a tightening paranoia that came from seeing their lives reflected on a screen watched by millions. But while they worried about fiction, the real threat was unfolding silently around them. The FBI had begun the single most intrusive, precise, and devastating surveillance operation New Jersey's underworld had ever faced. And no one, not even Vincent Palermo, suspected how deeply the federal agents had already crawled into their world. The first wire wasn't installed in a dramatic midnight raid or a cinematic rooftop infiltration. It went in quietly, disguised as routine maintenance work in a dingy room above a storefront that looked too ordinary to be dangerous. The agents worked quickly, slipping the device into a vent, calibrating it to capture every whisper, every footstep, every sound that mattered. When they finished, the room looked unchanged, still dusty, still cramped, still dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. And that was the point. The best traps are the ones no one sees. That room wasn't random. It was one of the DeCavalcante's trusted meeting spots. A place they believed was safe, private, unmonitored. A place where business was discussed freely. Instructions given openly. Names spoken without fear. For decades, the family relied on rooms like this. Small sanctuaries where secrets felt protected. The FBI wanted to turn those sanctuaries into evidence factories. Once the first wire proved successful, more followed. A back office in a club. A basement under a union hall. A small dining area in a pizzeria used for sit-downs. Every place the FBI suspected could host conversations worth hearing became a target. And the agents were patient. They didn't need dramatic confessions or explosive statements. They needed patterns, names, structures, the truth spoken quietly in passing. The DeCavalcante family, especially under Vincent's calm leadership, wasn't reckless with their words. But even careful men make mistakes when they believe they are talking in a safe environment. And the walls, they were listening. Every sigh, every frustration, every subtle acknowledgement of a crime committed weeks, months, or years earlier. The FBI collected it all, piece by piece, like archaeologists dusting ancient bones from the earth. By 1998, the agents running the operation had audio files so detailed they could recognize each capo's voice without seeing their face. They knew who interrupted conversations, who hesitated, who whispered when others spoke freely. They knew who expressed loyalty and who expressed doubt. They didn't just record conversations. They studied personalities. They mapped relationships. They predicted tensions. The wiretaps had become windows into the soul of the organization. Inside those recordings, one voice appeared more often than almost any other. Vincent's. Calm, composed, steady. He didn't reveal much. He didn't panic. He didn't brag. But his authority, soft, measured, undeniable, came through in every conversation. The FBI agents grew fascinated by him. They referred to him informally as the quiet one, the calm one, the one they follow. They didn't know the full picture yet, but they understood he was the gravitational center of the family. Still, Vincent had no idea how exposed he had become. He trusted certain spaces, trusted certain routines, trusted silence. And silence had always been his advantage, until the walls learned how to steal it. In early 1999, a meeting took place inside a club the FBI had wired months earlier. It was a routine gathering, nothing special. Soldiers discussing money brought in from bookmaking and gambling. A capo correcting one associate for late collections. A minor grievance about a business owner dragging his feet on payments. The usual complaints. Nothing dramatic. Nothing violent. And then, casually, someone brought up the show, The Sopranos. The men laughed at first, the same uneasy laughter that had become common. One soldier joked that a character reminded him of someone in the room. Another joked that the fictional strip club looked cleaner than their real ones. The banter escalated, turning into a conversation the FBI agents found far more informative than expected. One soldier leaned forward and said, "They got some of this stuff too, right? You know, the meetings, the unions, the way the boss keeps distance." The room quieted. Then the soldier added, "Feels like they're watching us." Simple words. Innocent, almost. But inside an FBI office, a federal agent paused the recording and leaned closer to the speaker, eyebrows raised. The men in the club weren't confessing crimes. They weren't exposing secrets. But their discomfort, their suspicion, their recognition of patterns, they revealed a psychological shift that investigators could exploit. The paranoia was growing, and paranoia makes men careless. In another recording, deeper in the year, the FBI captured a conversation between two capos discussing potential threats. They talked about a soldier who had grown unreliable. They talked about rumors of federal pressure. They complained about younger recruits who didn't understand silence. And then one of them said something that made the agents lean in harder. "Even the boss is getting looked at." The FBI froze the recording again. This was what they needed. Not the statement itself, but the acknowledgement that the DeCavalcantes viewed Vincent as their acting leader. It wasn't formal. It wasn't ceremonial. But it was recognition, and recognition carried legal weight. The agent called them linguists, analysts, prosecutors. They dissected every syllable, every pause, every intonation. They began shaping the narrative they would eventually present to a grand jury. And all the while, the DeCavalcantes continued speaking in rooms they believed were safe. Another recording captured a heated argument about territory disputes. A soldier made an impulsive comment about a violent act committed years earlier. No specifics, just enough implication to suggest involvement. Enough to create problems if prosecutors connected dots. Enough to make the agents smile grimly in their monitoring station. The wiretaps weren't just collecting words. They were collecting atmosphere. Fear, frustration, confusion. The FBI had always known the DeCavalcante family existed. But now they had something far more valuable than suspicion. Personality, hierarchy, resentment, and cracks forming from within. Vincent wasn't reckless with his words, but he wasn't immune to the trap. In meetings, he often tried to calm tensions. He redirected conversations. He explained business rationally. He avoided acknowledging anything that could be construed as incriminating. But even logic can betray a man if the wrong sentence is spoken at the wrong moment. In one recorded meeting, he chastised a soldier for causing unnecessary attention in a club. He didn't mention crimes. He didn't describe violence. But he spoke with authority, and authority was exactly what the FBI needed to show control. A single calm instruction, handle it quietly, became a point of analysis, a point of interpretation, a potential piece of evidence. And the agents weren't done. They placed cameras, hidden, subtle, nearly invisible, in spots the family frequented. The grainy footage captured capos entering rooms with guarded expressions, soldiers pacing nervously, associates carrying envelopes of cash. Sometimes the video captured nothing more than men sitting, leaning, adjusting their clothes, waiting. Those moments, mundane as they appeared, became visual proof of hierarchy, association, routine. As the evidence mounted, the FBI realized they had stumbled into a gold mine. Not because the DeCavalcantes were reckless, but because they believed themselves protected by tradition. For generations, the Mafia survived by controlling its environment. Rooms, tables, routines. They knew which spaces were safe and which weren't. But this time, the walls themselves had turned traitor. During one particularly revealing recording, a capo discussed frustrations with an associate. He complained about laziness, disrespect, and unreliability. But then he said something that resonated through the entire investigation. Vinny knows who's weak. He sees everything. That sentence didn't incriminate Vincent, but it confirmed something far more critical: his psychological control over the family. The FBI understood the power of such statements. They weren't just collecting evidence. They were building a story. And in that story, Vincent wasn't a background figure. He was the center. As the investigation deepened, the agents noticed a pattern emerging in the recordings. The men trusted Vincent. They sought his approval. They validated his decisions. His calm presence had become a stabilizing force. And the stabilizing force was now the target federal prosecutors wanted most. By mid-1999, the FBI had enough material to launch Operation Heat, the largest crackdown on the DeCavalcante family in its history. But they held back. They wanted more. They wanted clarity. They wanted certainty. And they wanted to see if someone inside the family would break under pressure. And someone did. In late 1999, the FBI captured a recording that would shift the entire trajectory of the investigation. It happened during a routine conversation, two men chatting in a shop, drinking coffee, thinking they were alone. One of them began complaining about the way certain decisions were being made. He didn't name Vincent directly, but the implication was obvious. "They got him running things," the man muttered. "But he ain't the only one they listened to." The other man quickly shushed him. But the damage was done. That slip, small, accidental, spoken without thought, told the agents something profound. There was internal tension. Someone didn't like Vincent's leadership. Someone felt overshadowed. Someone was jealous. And jealousy is the perfect opening for a federal agent. As the year drew toward its end, the FBI finished assembling one of the most extensive Mafia surveillance packages ever constructed in New Jersey. Audio, video, transcripts, visual analysis, behavioral studies, patterns of speech, patterns of movement. They had everything they needed. But the DeCavalcantes still didn't know the walls around them had already begun to collapse. The family was too busy fighting shadows created by a television show to notice the real shadows crawling beneath their feet. They were too busy whispering theories about Hollywood writers to notice the microphones installed behind the drywall. They were too busy comparing themselves to fictional characters to realize that fiction wasn't the threat. Reality was. And reality was about to strike with a force no episode of television could ever match. Because the next morning, the FBI made a decision that would shatter everything the family believed it controlled. It was time to move. And when Operation Heat hit, Vincent Palermo, quiet, steady, invisible Vincent, would find his entire world exposed in ways he had spent his whole life avoiding. When the FBI finally decided to move forward with Operation Heat, the DeCavalcante family didn't feel the impact all at once. It didn't come crashing down like a building imploding. It began subtly, almost invisibly, like a cold draft sliding under a locked door. A strange car parked for too long on a quiet street. A familiar face suddenly avoiding eye contact. A routine meeting that felt unusually heavy, as if someone inside the room knew something no one else did. The change didn't scream. It whispered. And whispers, inside a Mafia family already vibrating with paranoia, carried the sharpness of a blade. The first sign came when one of the soldiers, a man with a reputation for talking too much when drinking, went quiet. Too quiet. For weeks, he avoided gatherings. He made excuses to skip meetings. He changed his routine, stopped showing up at the club he practically lived in. To ordinary people, these were harmless shifts. But inside the DeCavalcante family, silence was never harmless. It was a message, a warning, a signal that something was breaking. Vincent noticed immediately. He always noticed changes in patterns. That was his strength. His instincts read men the way trained musicians read notes on a page. The soldier's absence gnawed at him. It wasn't fear that Vincent felt. It was calculation, a quiet assessment of risk, a mental accounting of the soldier's behavior over the past year. Every argument, every moment of weakness, every instance where he seemed overwhelmed by pressure. Vincent replayed these memories inside his mind like clues in a puzzle. And the more he replayed them, the clearer the picture became. Someone was cracking. But Vincent didn't react. He didn't call the man out. He didn't demand an explanation. He waited. Because waiting revealed truths far more effectively than confrontation. And in a matter of days, the truth revealed itself through someone else. Another member whose tone shifted in a conversation about upcoming business. He spoke cautiously, too cautiously, as if aware that every word might be recorded, as if he was acting instead of speaking naturally, as if he had been warned. Vincent's stomach tightened in a way it rarely did, and that tension spread through the rest of the organization. By early 1999, the DeCavalcantes were caught between two storms, one outside, from the government, and one inside, from men losing faith in their own ability to survive. The FBI surveillance was invisible, but its effects were not. Conversations felt shorter. Jokes fell flat. Men who once moved confidently through the streets now glanced over their shoulders before speaking. It didn't matter whether they had anything to hide. Fear doesn't need guilt to thrive. It only needs the possibility of consequence. And consequence was coming for all of them. Inside FBI headquarters, agents were analyzing wiretaps with increasing precision. They could identify stress in voices, recognize hesitation, detect inconsistencies. They weren't just listening for confessions. They were listening for the tremble of fear, the crack of doubt. They knew that fear, handled correctly, becomes leverage, and leverage breaks men. It began with a soldier named Fat Anthony. His name wasn't important. His reliability was. He had been part of the family for years, but he wasn't strong enough to withstand the pressure of federal scrutiny. The FBI approached him quietly, at a moment when he believed he was simply being questioned. They presented him with partial evidence, not the real evidence, but enough to make him understand that they were close. Too close. They offered him a choice. He didn't answer immediately, but fear settled in his eyes like dust, and once fear falls, it doesn't lift. Vincent didn't know the details, but he knew the symptoms. He saw the way Anthony's posture shifted when he walked in a club, the way he avoided certain men, the way he watched conversations instead of participating in them. These were small things, invisible to most. But to Vincent, they were glaring red flags. He spoke to a trusted capo about the man, gently probing for insight. The capo shrugged it off at first, then hesitated, a hesitation Vincent didn't overlook. "He's acting strange," the capo admitted, lowering his voice. "Nervous, like he's got something on his mind." Vincent didn't respond right away. He only nodded, a small nod, almost imperceptible. But inside, the alarm bells rang louder. The second man to crack was a younger associate, someone with ambition, but not nearly enough courage. The feds approached him after months of listening to him complain on tape. Complaints about money. Complaints about a capo who disrespected him. Complaints about the slow pace of his rise. Ambition without loyalty is a poison, and the FBI recognized that poison quickly. When they pulled him into an interrogation room, he folded faster than anyone expected. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't try to negotiate. He spilled everything he knew, and then he began guessing, filling in blanks to make himself seem more valuable. The feds weren't looking for perfect accuracy. They were looking for momentum, and momentum is exactly what they got. Vincent didn't know about the interrogation, but he felt a shift in the wind. People talked differently. They moved differently. Even the air inside the social clubs felt heavier, thicker. These weren't changes caused by television shows or rumors. These were the changes of a family quietly realizing it was being hunted. The third betrayal cut deeper. It came from someone closer to the hierarchy, someone Vincent trusted. Not fully, but enough to believe he wouldn't break easily. But pressure doesn't care about strength. It only cares about weakness. And everyone, no matter how loyal they appear, has a weak point. The FBI found this man's weak point in the form of a financial investigation involving a relative. The agents didn't need to threaten him directly. They threatened someone he cared about. It took fewer than 2 hours for him to agree to cooperate. Not openly, not loudly, quietly, just like the way the family operated. That was the most dangerous kind of betrayal. Quiet betrayal. A man who continues showing up at meetings, continues shaking hands, continues smiling, all while feeding information to the agents building a case that could bury them all. Inside the DeCavalcante family, paranoia grew like mold in a basement. Dark, spreading, constant. Men began second-guessing every conversation, every nod, every handshake, every look. And once paranoid whispers about the Sopranos had now shifted into real fear about who was talking to the feds. Vincent remained calm on the outside. He held meetings. He reassured capos. He maintained structure. But internally, he felt something he rarely felt. Pressure that didn't come from outside, but from the inside collapsing in on itself. He listened carefully during every conversation, paying attention not to the words spoken, but to the pauses between them. He watched for trembling hands, darting eyes, unnecessary explanations. He studied silence with the intensity of a surgeon studying a patient's heartbeat, because silence reveals what words hide. During one meeting in early 1999, Vincent noticed something unusual. A capo, usually loud and confident, kept glancing at the door every few seconds, as if expecting it to burst open. Another soldier, normally calm, fumbled with his cigarette. And a third, someone Vincent considered reliable, stared at the table instead of making eye contact. These patterns didn't align. These were the signs of a family unraveling. Vincent tried to hold it together. He called for order. He instructed men to stick to routines. He emphasized the importance of speaking less, moving carefully, keeping heads down. But fear, once rooted, doesn't respond to instructions. It spreads, and the FBI knew it. They were watching the paranoia grow in real time through their recordings. They heard the tension in men's voices. They heard the frustration. They heard the cracks widening. And they prepared to exploit every single one. A critical wiretap recording captured a conversation between two high-ranking members who discussed their fear of prison. One asked, "You think they already know everything?" The other replied, "Feels like someone's talking." That sentence, that small moment of fear, confirmed to the FBI that the family expected betrayal. And fear of betrayal often leads men to betray preemptively. One night, as Vincent drove home through quiet suburban streets, he sensed something shifting beneath the surface. He had always trusted his instincts. They saved him more times than he could count. And that night, those instincts whispered something chilling. Someone inside the family had already chosen survival over loyalty. The next morning, a trusted friend visited him, his voice low, his face pale. "Vinny," he whispered, "something's wrong. Guys are talking. Guys are scared. They're saying someone flipped." The words hung in the air like smoke. Vincent didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger or fear. He only asked one question. "Who?" No answer came. Only a helpless shrug. A look of dread. And that look told Vincent the truth. No one knew who had flipped. Which meant anyone could have. Which meant everyone was suspect. The betrayal didn't come from one man. It came from many. One by one, soldiers, associates, and even ranking members agreed to cooperate with the FBI. Some out of fear, some out of desperation, some because they saw the walls closing in and couldn't imagine dying in prison for a family already beginning to crumble. Each betrayal fed into the next, like dominoes falling in slow motion. By late 1999, the FBI had more cooperating witnesses than the family had reliable soldiers. They had tapes, confessions, surveillance logs, and detailed accounts of crimes that could be tied directly to the hierarchy. Vincent began noticing men avoiding him, not out of disrespect, but out of fear. Fear that even speaking to him could make them targets. Some stopped calling. Others stopped showing up at meetings. A few disappeared entirely. And then came the most devastating blow. The moment Vincent finally understood the full scope of the betrayal. A capo, someone respected, someone who had eaten in Vincent's home, someone who once laughed beside him at family gatherings, had agreed to wear a wire. That wire captured everything. Casual conversations, private frustrations, subtle instructions, the tone of leadership, the hierarchy, the unspoken rules. Not enough to convict on murder, but enough to build the structure of a racketeering case that could lock men away for decades. When the FBI agents played those recordings in their conference room, they didn't cheer. They didn't smile. They sat in stunned silence. They had everything they needed. Inside the DeCavalcante family, meanwhile, the betrayal remained invisible, like poison spreading through a bloodstream. Men began distancing themselves. Trust evaporated. Fear hardened. And Vincent, quiet, steady, controlled Vincent, found himself standing at the center of a storm he could not calm. He held on as long as he could. He tried to maintain order, tried to keep the men grounded, tried to quiet the growing panic. But the truth was undeniable. The real danger wasn't outside. The real danger was already inside. And the betrayal would soon explode in the most devastating way imaginable. Not through another whisper, but through a raid so massive, so overwhelming, that the quiet world Vincent built would collapse in a single morning. It happened just before dawn. Those quiet, brittle hours when suburban New Jersey feels suspended between sleep and waking, when the only sounds are distant car engines, humming streetlights, and the soft rustle of trees bending under cold morning wind. It was the hour when nothing important was supposed to happen. The hour when families slept, dogs curled at the foot of beds, and the world felt harmless. But on that morning in 1999, the stillness carried a hidden violence. A storm that had been building for years was finally ready to break. And when it did, it shattered the illusion of safety that had defined Vincent Palermo's world for decades. The operation had a name, Operation Heat, a title chosen quietly by federal agents who had spent months, even years, mapping every inch of the DeCavalcante family's inner workings. But for the men inside the organization, that name didn't matter. What mattered was how it arrived, sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to escape. In a world of organized crime, takedowns rarely feel like dramatic movie scenes. They feel like something closer to a medical procedure, precise, surgical, executed with cold efficiency. And Operation Heat was exactly that. The first knock came at 5 in the morning. Not a knock, really, more like a crash of fists and boots against a front door that had never known violence. A soldier jolted awake, heart racing, confused, half dreaming, thinking maybe he'd heard thunder or a car accident outside. But then the shouts followed. Federal agents calling his name, a battering ram hammering at the frame. The noise was too aggressive to ignore, too sharp to mistake for anything else. Inside that house, the soldier's wife screamed. A child cried. A dog barked wildly, unsure whom to protect. The soldier's body reacted faster than his mind. Instinct told him to run, but logic told him it was useless. By the time he reached the hallway, armed agents were already inside. His hands went up without resistance. His wife watched with a look caught between terror and disbelief. The child cried louder. The dog kept barking. And as he was handcuffed and dragged away, he understood the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't a misunderstanding. Minutes later, another door crashed open across town. Then another. And another. 47 homes in total, all hit within minutes of each other. Streets that normally saw nothing more dangerous than a neighbor's cat now swarmed with armored vehicles, agents in tactical gear, and flashing emergency lights that turned quiet blocks into chaotic scenes of red and blue reflections bouncing off windows. Inside Vincent's neighborhood, the calm he had always relied on, the quiet mornings, the steady predictability, was shattered as several unmarked cars slid silently into his street. They didn't turn on sirens. They didn't shout. They didn't rush. They moved with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going and exactly who they were coming for. Inside his home, Vincent was awake before the agents reached the door. He wasn't startled by the sounds outside. He wasn't confused. He wasn't even angry. He felt something colder, an understanding that the moment he had tried to avoid his entire adult life had finally arrived. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This wasn't speculation. This was real. His wife, half asleep, whispered his name. He told her everything was all right, though he didn't believe it himself. He told her to go back to bed, told her not to open the door, told her not to worry. But his voice lacked the calm confidence it usually carried, and she heard that difference immediately. By the time he reached the living room, the pounding began. Not frantic, not violent, controlled. The kind of knock that said resistance would be pointless. Vincent looked at the door for a long second, taking in the weight of the moment. Then he opened it. Dozens of agents filled the entryway, their bodies silhouetted against the early morning gloom. Some held papers. Some held guns. All of them regarded him with a mix of respect and caution. They weren't dealing with a violent man. They were dealing with a powerful one. And powerful men, even quiet ones, could be dangerous in ways guns could not stop. Vincent Palermo, an agent, said, reading from a warrant, "You are under arrest." The words were expected, but hearing them spoken aloud felt suffocating. He nodded, calmly, almost politely, because that was who he was, controlled even in collapse. Inside the house, his children stirred from sleep. His wife, trembling, appeared in the hallway. Vincent didn't want them to see the handcuffs. "Please," he said quietly to the agents, "let me walk out on my own. Don't do it in front of them." Someone hesitated, then nodded. Small mercies aren't common in these operations, but sometimes they happen. Vincent stepped outside, hands behind his back only after the door closed behind him. Around New Jersey, similar scenes unfolded simultaneously. Men who once walked with swagger now stumbled in shock, blinking in disbelief. Wives asked questions agents couldn't answer. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Children watched their fathers being taken away by strangers with badges. The takedown wasn't just a law enforcement action. It was a psychological assault designed to break the organization's rhythm. The feds knew that if they hit everyone at once, the family wouldn't have time to coordinate a response, destroy evidence, or warn one another. Fear would spread faster than information. Inside the vans transporting them, the arrested mobsters were silent. No one tried to make conversation. No one made jokes. They sat with the knowledge that this wasn't a small problem. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something massive, something carefully orchestrated, something irreversible. They arrived at the federal building in Newark, where a long corridor of agents, lawyers, and assistants waited. One by one, the men were processed, mugshots taken, fingerprints collected, questions asked, papers signed. The process felt mechanical, cold, almost humiliating for men who once commanded respect with a nod. Vincent was processed separately. Agents treated him with a formal politeness reserved for someone they considered intelligent and potentially dangerous, but not in a violent way. Dangerous in influence, dangerous in impact, dangerous in the information he might hold. In the interrogation room, Vincent sat quietly. He didn't speak. He didn't show fear. He didn't ask questions. He merely observed the agents, the room, the cameras, the posture of the interrogators. He understood this world now, and he understood that silence, the very thing he had built his life around, might no longer protect him. While he sat there, other members broke quickly. Operation Heat had been built on months of wiretaps, informants, hidden cameras, and secret recordings. The federal agents knew everything. Who ran what, who answered to whom, who had authority, who skimmed money, who bragged, who complained. They didn't need confessions to build the case. They needed confessions to secure convictions. The first man to crack wasn't the youngest. It wasn't the most frightened. It was the angriest. The kind of man who believed he deserved more respect, more money, more power. He felt betrayed by the hierarchy. felt overlooked, felt resentful. And resentful men don't break. They explode. When the agents offered him a chance to save himself, he grabbed it. Not out of fear, but out of spite. The second was a soldier with a sick wife. He wasn't loyal to the family. He was loyal to his family. And when the agents subtly implied that cooperation might ease the burden on his wife, he folded almost instantly. The third was someone no one expected, an older man, deeply rooted in the organization, respected by many. But age had made him cautious. And caution, under federal pressure, becomes self-preservation. Each confession lit up the FBI's board like a pin dropped onto a map. Each betrayal built on the last. And each new revelation confirmed what the agents already suspected. The DeCavalcante family was collapsing from within. While the others cracked, Vincent remained silent. He asked for nothing. He revealed nothing. He waited. His silence wasn't defiance. It wasn't bravado. It was assessment. But the federal agents weren't relying solely on interrogation. They had transcripts, hundreds of them, photographs, videos, audio recordings. They had years of evidence woven into a narrative so detailed that even the most loyal mobster would struggle to deny it. The structure of the family, the chain of command, the gambling operations, the construction rackets, the strip clubs, the extortion, the meetings, the money, the conversations about the Sopranos, about potential informants, about leadership, about fears, about threats. It was all there. When prosecutors assembled the men in a room to explain the charges, the shock was palpable. Racketeering, extortion, bookmaking, loan sharking, conspiracy, murder. Decades' worth of crimes suddenly crystallized into a single wall of accusations so overwhelming that the room went quiet. One man put his head in his hands. Another cursed under his breath. A third stared blankly at the floor, unable to comprehend that his entire life had just crumbled in a matter of hours. But perhaps the most profound reaction came from a capo who whispered, almost inaudibly, "We're finished." That sentence spread like poison. Finished. Inside the interrogation room, as agents prepared to question Vincent properly, they believed they had everything they needed. They believed they understood him. They believed that a man like him, calculated, measured, controlled, might choose cooperation if presented with the right pressure. But they didn't fully understand Vincent Palermo. Not yet. He didn't fear prison in the way other men did. He didn't fear violence. He didn't fear loss of status. His fear was quieter, deeper, more complex. Fear of losing control over the narrative of his own life. Fear of becoming a pawn. Fear of being forced into a corner where silence no longer protected him. Agents entered the room, papers in hand, prepared to recite evidence. But when they looked into his eyes, they realized something unsettling. He wasn't surprised by any of it. Not truly. He had sensed the betrayal coming long before the first knock at his door. He had smelled it in the air, tasted it in conversations, felt it in the tension of rooms. He had known the walls were closing in. And now, sitting there in silence, he wasn't panicking. He was deciding whether to stay loyal to a family already collapsing under its own weight. Deciding whether silence would bury him. Deciding whether survival meant betraying everything he once believed in. The agents presented the evidence. Calmly, methodically, like surgeons laying out instruments before a complex procedure. Then they waited. The silence stretched, and stretched, and stretched, until finally, after a lifetime of quiet loyalty, Vincent Palermo lifted his eyes and spoke for the first time since the arrest. A single sentence. A sentence that would change the fate of the DeCavalcante family forever. Who else is talking? And with that question, the quietest man in New Jersey signaled that everything, his loyalty, his future, his identity, was about to shift in a way no one could have predicted. Because the decision he made next would not just dismantle the DeCavalcante family. It would rewrite the entire story of the real Tony Soprano. The moment the words left Vincent Palermo's mouth, "Who else is talking?" the room seemed to shift. Even the fluorescent lights overhead, humming with a dull, electric fatigue, felt tighter, sharper, as if absorbing the weight of the choice he was about to make. The agents across from him exchanged a single look, not triumphant, not smug, but alert. They knew what that question meant. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't casual. It was a signal. Vincent was calculating. And a calculating man was a man who could be persuaded. He wasn't folding. Not yet. But he was leaning. They didn't answer immediately. Good interrogators never rush the moment a dam begins to crack. They let silence press against it until the pressure becomes unbearable. One agent leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, voice low enough to seem confidential, but clear enough to carry authority. "You're not the only one sitting here, Vincent. Everyone's talking." Vincent didn't blink, didn't move, but something behind his eyes shifted. An acceptance, maybe, or the faintest tremor of realization. For years, he had watched the DeCavalcante family from above, guiding them quietly, stabilizing them, holding their chaos in place. But now he was seeing that same organization from a new angle. A man in a chair, a man under fluorescent bulbs, a man waiting to hear whether the empire he helped maintain had already fallen without him. The agent continued, "You've been loyal a long time. We know that. But let's be honest, your loyalty hasn't been repaid." That sentence hit deeper than the agents understood. Because loyalty had never been simple for Vincent. It had been a shield, a quiet virtue, a survival mechanism. He had built his identity around not breaking, not spilling, not faltering. But the truth was darker. Loyalty only works when the people around you honor it. And now the family he protected was collapsing from within, each betrayal pushing him closer to a choice he never imagined making. "Your people are talking about you," another agent said. "They're blaming you, saying you made the calls, saying you were the one pulling the strings." It wasn't fully true. It wasn't fully false. It lived in the gray space interrogators rely on, the space where fear distorts logic. For the first time since the arrest, Vincent's jaw tightened. The agents noticed. They pressed. "You're being set up to take the fall." He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He simply stared at the table, as if the grain in the wood could reveal the truth. Part of him knew the agents were using strategy. But another part, the part formed inside him long before he ever joined the family, could feel something real beneath it. He had spent years cleaning up other men's mistakes. Years protecting men who wanted glory without responsibility. Years navigating paranoia, greed, and recklessness. And now those same men were in small interrogation rooms across the building, doing what frightened men do best. Saving themselves. The agent slid a stack of transcripts toward him. Names circled. Statements highlighted. Audio timestamps scribbled in the margins. Evidence. Pages and pages of it. Some from men he barely trusted. Some from men he trusted a little. And one from a man he had once considered reliable. He didn't reach for the papers. Didn't need to. The message was clear. The silence that followed stretched long enough to feel physical. The agents let it sit, the weight of betrayal filling the room like smoke. Then, softly, one agent asked the question that would decide the direction of the next decade of Vincent's life. "You ready to save yourself?" For a long moment, nothing moved. Not the air, not the table, not even Vincent's breath. He had always known the Mafia could turn on its own. He had seen it happen. He had watched quiet rumors turn into deadly decisions. But he had always believed he was the exception, the calm man, the reliable man, the man who didn't create chaos. He believed his steadiness earned him protection. And yet here he was, facing the truth every mobster eventually faces. The only loyalty that lasts is the loyalty a man keeps to himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost too steady. "What do you need?" The agents didn't smile. They didn't congratulate him. They simply nodded and began explaining the process. The legal terms, the expectations, the restrictions, the protections, the consequences. They spoke clinically, professionally, as if discussing a business contract instead of the dismantling of a mafia family. Vincent listened to every word. His cooperation began quietly. He didn't confess everything at once. He didn't dump the entirety of the family's history onto the table. He moved through the details slowly, carefully, with the same deliberate precision he used to navigate business meetings. He named names, explained structures, clarified roles, corrected assumptions. He offered enough to establish trust with the agents while still protecting information he wasn't ready to reveal. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the dam opened wider. He attended debriefing sessions regularly, sometimes for hours, sometimes deep into the night. Agents learned to read his silences, distinguishing between contemplation and reluctance. They asked questions delicately, sometimes circling a subject for days before he chose to answer. And gradually, the truth emerged. He explained the gambling operations, the construction rackets, the union influence, the strip clubs, the hierarchy. He gave details no wiretap could capture, conversations that took place in cars, in basements on long drives home. He explained the tensions inside the family, the disputes, the internal betrayals. He confirmed the cracks investigators had suspected but never proven. He talked about violence, not graphically, not proudly, but with a cold factual distance that revealed how normalized it had become. He discussed the Fred Weiss murder, the way it had been planned, the fear behind it, the shift it created inside the family. He didn't brag. He didn't justify. He simply recounted events like someone reading from an old ledger. But what shocked the agents most wasn't the crimes. It was how deeply Vincent understood the psychology of the family. He described how fear spread, how ambition warped judgment, how disrespect escalated into violence, how paranoia shaped decisions more than strategy. He explained how a family held together by silence could collapse because of a single whisper. His insight wasn't just helpful, it was invaluable. The prosecutors built their case around his testimony. The FBI rewrote their understanding of New Jersey's underworld through his lens. Even seasoned agents found themselves stunned by the depth of detail he provided. For years, the DeCavalcantes had operated beneath radar, overshadowed by New York's famous five families. But now, through Vincent's words, their world unfolded with frightening clarity. Yet cooperation didn't erase danger. The Mafia had long memories. If anyone suspected Vincent of flipping, he would be marked for death, no matter how far he ran, no matter where he hid. He understood that. The agents understood that. And so preparations began to protect him. He was moved to secure locations, escorted discreetly, held in controlled environments. His family became part of the process, whether they wanted to or not. They were questioned, relocated, protected. But protection did not erase the emotional toll. His wife struggled. His children asked questions he couldn't answer. The stability he worked so hard to create crumbled under the weight of consequences. At night, in quiet safe houses, he sat alone thinking about everything he had built and everything he had destroyed. He thought about the men he had known since he was young, men he had laughed with, worked with, trusted, men whose secrets he now held like weapons. Men who would never forgive him. Men who might never see freedom again. He thought about the hierarchy he once guided with calm precision. How it had begun to collapse the moment he chose to save himself. He thought about the silence that had once been his greatest strength, now shattered by his own voice. But he also thought about survival. For years, he had survived because he stayed quiet. Now he would survive because he spoke. The trial preparations consumed years. From 1999 to 2003, prosecutors built one of the most devastating mafia cases New Jersey had ever seen. Vincent's testimony became the backbone. His insights filled the gaps left by surveillance. His explanations turned vague suspicions into coherent narratives juries could understand. And as the legal machinery churned forward, the DeCavalcante family imploded. Arrests mounted. Convictions followed. Men who once walked with authority now shuffled into courtrooms in shackles. Some screamed betrayal. Some cried. Some stared blankly ahead, unable to comprehend that the life they believed was eternal had collapsed like a house of paper. One capo, once powerful, once feared, whispered angrily during his sentencing, "He ruined us." Vinny ruined us. But the truth was far more complicated. Vincent hadn't ruined them. They had ruined themselves long before he ever spoke. By the time the trials ended, the DeCavalcante family of old was gone. A few remnants survived. Small crews, scattered influence, loose connections. But the structure that once held New Jersey's underworld together had evaporated. And Vincent, the quiet boss who resembled Tony Soprano more than he ever admitted, had done something no one expected. He walked away from the Mafia alive. He didn't disappear into a grave, or serve a life sentence, or vanish at the hands of his own men. He stepped into a different kind of life, a life under government protection, a life built on secrecy and caution, a life far from New Jersey. By 2003, preparations were complete. His cooperation had ended. His usefulness had been exhausted, and the government was ready to relocate him. The day he left New Jersey for the final time, he didn't look back. But looking back wasn't necessary, because the past wasn't chasing him. It was waiting for the moment he stepped into witness protection, waiting for the moment he tried to start over, waiting for the moment he realized that flipping on the Mafia wasn't the end of danger. It was the beginning, and the next chapter of his life, the one he could never have predicted, was already forming like a distant storm on the horizon. When the plane touched down in Texas, Vincent Palermo sat quietly in his seat, hands folded, eyes locked on the window as the landscape rolled past in blurry strips of muted brown and sun-baked gold. He had been to many places in his life. New Jersey neighborhoods where every crack in the sidewalk carried story. New York backrooms where decisions changed lives with a nod. Social clubs where silence ruled. But this was different. This wasn't travel. This wasn't business. This was exile. The beginning of a life he never asked for and never imagined he would live. A life where his name, once spoken in whispers or with deference, meant nothing at all. The agents escorting him didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Vincent understood the routine by now. He had been briefed on the rules. New identity, new address, new story, new habits. Leave the past behind. Never reveal anything. Never slip. Never revert to who he used to be. In witness protection, the greatest danger wasn't the men hunting you. It was the version of yourself you forgot to bury. When he stepped off the plane, the humidity wrapped around him instantly. Thick, heavy, relentless. Nothing like the cool nights of New Jersey or the rhythmic wind off the Hudson. Texas air felt alive, almost aggressive, as if testing him. The agents led him to an unmarked car, drove him through neighborhoods he didn't recognize, past billboards advertising barbecue joints and evangelical churches, past sprawling suburbs that looked identical except for the color of the siding. Finally, they stopped in front of a modest house in a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the opposite of everything his life had been. No drama, no shadows, no whispered meetings, no coded glances. Just perfect lawns, friendly porches, and neighbors who waved at strangers. A place built on routine, not secrets. He walked inside and stood in the living room, listening to the silence. No footsteps of soldiers coming and going. No ringing phones with urgent messages. No men leaning against walls waiting for instructions. Just silence. A silence so thick it almost echoed. His new identity was handed to him. A name that felt uncomfortable on his tongue. A history that belonged to someone who didn't exist. Paperwork linking him to a past that never happened. "Do you have any questions?" an agent asked. Vincent shook his head. He wasn't ready for questions. He wasn't ready for answers. Over the next weeks, he settled into a routine that felt foreign, almost surreal. Simple things, grocery shopping, reading the newspaper on the porch, making small talk with neighbors, required concentration. He wasn't used to people who smiled without intent, who spoke casually about weather instead of coded messages about loyalty and danger. He wasn't used to being just another man on the block. But even as the witness protection program tried to wrap him in anonymity, something inside him remained unchanged. The part of him that understood power, understood opportunity, understood how money flowed in unseen currents through any city, no matter how ordinary it appeared. Houston, he learned quickly, was not ordinary. Behind its suburban calm, The city pulsed with underground economies, gentlemen's clubs, adult businesses, cash-heavy operations that lived in shadows even on the brightest days. And unlike New Jersey, no one here knew his face. No one knew his past. No one treated him like a mob boss, a target, a threat, or a leader. For the first time, he had the freedom to rebuild, not as Vincent Palermo, the silent Don of New Jersey, but as the anonymous businessman he now pretended to be. He didn't seek out trouble, but trouble has a way of finding men who know how to control it. It started with a casual conversation in a bar, a man complaining about poor management at a local strip club, a mention of ownership disputes, a comment about cash being untracked, something about permits, something about dancers quitting, something about opportunities. Vincent listened quietly, sipping his drink. He wasn't interested in gossip, but he was interested in leverage. He visited the club, purely out of curiosity at first. The place was run poorly, unorganized, chaotic, inconsistent. To most men, it looked like a failure. To Vincent, it looked like potential. He had spent years running clubs that thrived under his control. He knew how to attract customers, stabilize staff, regulate money, and keep the peace. Clubs were ecosystems, and he understood every instinct within them. It didn't take long for word to spread that the quiet, polite man with the unfamiliar accent had a talent for solving problems. At first, he offered advice casually, without drawing attention. He pointed out organizational issues, suggested hiring adjustments, helped negotiate disputes. People listened, not because they knew his background, but because he made sense. His calm demeanor, once the cornerstone of his Mafia leadership, translated perfectly into an environment where ego and chaos often led businesses to fail. Soon, he was asked to take a larger role. Not ownership, not officially, but influence. Decision-making, direction, stabilization. And Vincent, despite years of violence and survival in New Jersey, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose. Not criminal purpose. Not power. Just a strange, quiet feeling of competence. He knew how to manage clubs. He knew how to make money flow smoothly. His skills were transferable, adaptable, surprisingly compatible with this new world. Little by little, he became involved in more clubs. Some directly, some indirectly. Owners trusted him. Employees respected him. Clients liked him. And he never revealed who he really was. Houston had no idea that the man running their nightlife had once controlled a Mafia family in New Jersey. But invisible success is still success. And success attracts scrutiny. The quiet empire he built in Texas didn't go unnoticed. Competitors grew suspicious. Business rivals wondered how a newcomer had risen so quickly. Schools of sharks circled his clubs, looking for weaknesses. Landlords asked questions. Lawyers whispered rumors. The sort of rumors that spread quietly through business circles the same way rumors spread through Mafia crews. And then came the lawsuit. Unexpected, sharp, disruptive. A wrongful death claim involving an incident at one of the clubs Vincent controlled. A woman had died under unclear circumstances, and her family, guided by ambitious attorneys, demanded answers. At first, Vincent treated it as a business problem. Something to be managed, something to be resolved. But the lawsuit did something he didn't expect. It peeled back layers, pulled documents, exposed management ties, identified names, followed trails, and eventually, inevitably, someone found a connection to a man who shouldn't exist. A man who sounded suspiciously like someone else. Questions grew. Investigators, smelling opportunity, dug deeper. Reporters began calling. Journalists whispered among themselves about the possibility that the quiet businessman might be more than he appeared. They searched public records, found inconsistencies, found missing years, found trails that ended abruptly, and they pushed harder. Vincent's name began appearing in quiet conversations. Not out loud, not in headlines, but in the spaces where reporters test the foundations of a story before breaking it open. A rumor first, then a suspicion, then a lead. One investigative journalist claimed he had uncovered the truth. claimed he had traced the new identity back to witness protection, claimed he knew the Houston strip club operator was actually the former boss of the New Jersey Mafia. Whether he was right or just lucky didn't matter, because the moment the rumor hit legal ears, everything changed. The attorneys pursuing the wrongful death case added the allegation to their filings. Not as fact, as suspicion. But suspicion was enough. It made waves. It forced federal officials to respond. And once they responded, the truth could no longer remain buried under paperwork. Vincent wasn't just exposed. He was exposed spectacularly. Newspapers picked up the story. Reporters dug deeper. Cameras gathered outside clubs he had influence over. Former employees spoke on the record. People who once trusted him recoiled. Local law enforcement, caught off guard, scrambled to understand why a man like him was even in their jurisdiction. The story spread, and when it reached New Jersey, the shock was immense. Men who once served under him, some in prison, some still on the street, read the headlines and felt a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. The quiet Don they once followed was now a strip club operator in Texas, living under a new name, protected by the government. Some laughed, some cursed, some felt betrayed all over again. Vincent, for the first time in years, felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in. Not mafia walls, not federal walls, public walls. Exposure is a dangerous thing, not because of what people learn, but because of what exposure changes. In witness protection, anonymity is life. Once anonymity dissolves, so does security. Federal agents intervened quickly. They questioned him, questioned his activities, questioned the scope of his businesses, questioned whether he had violated rules of the program. They moved him again, relocated him, tightened restrictions, rebuilt the walls around him. But the damage was done. He was no longer anonymous. He wasn't safe anymore. He wasn't invisible. And perhaps most frightening of all, he wasn't sure he wanted to be. Because somewhere along the way, in the long, quiet years between 1999 and 2010, he had grown comfortable in Texas, comfortable running businesses, comfortable living without mafia politics, comfortable existing as an ordinary man with extraordinary knowledge of the world's underbelly. He had built something new, and now he feared losing it just as much as he once feared losing his life. The lawsuit remained unresolved. The rumors persisted. The attention intensified. And the government, balancing protection with scrutiny, realized that Vincent's life in Texas was becoming untenable. More relocations followed, more interrogations, more safety protocols, more distance from the world he had rebuilt. And through all of it, Vincent faced a truth he had avoided for years. You can outrun the mafia. You can outrun law enforcement. You can outrun your past. But you cannot outrun the version of yourself that the world demands to see. By 2010, the life he had crafted in Houston was fading. The club slipped away. The anonymity dissolved. The new identity frayed. The government tightened around him. And the world outside, the world of headlines, lawsuits, rumor, memory, kept knocking on the door. He had gone from mafia boss to government witness, from suburban don to strip club king, from invisible to exposed. But the final chapter of his story was still unwritten. One more transformation waited for him in the shadows. One more reckoning. One more moment where silence, his greatest weapon, would decide what kind of man he became in the end. And as that final transformation approached, one question lingered in the air like smoke. What becomes of a man who can no longer hide in the world he once controlled? By the time the second decade of the 21st century arrived, the world had already shifted far from the days when mafia families controlled construction sites, union halls, social clubs, and small neighborhoods with nothing more than a nod or a whispered threat. Technology had changed the landscape. Surveillance had evolved. Crime had migrated from alleyways and storefronts to digital networks and offshore accounts. And the old world way of doing things, the carefully measured power of the quiet dawn, felt like a relic from another lifetime. For Vincent Palermo, that shift was more than societal. It was personal. The man who once held New Jersey's underworld together with soft-spoken authority now lived inside a world where his past mattered more than his present. The strip club empire he built in Houston had evaporated under scrutiny. The anonymity that witness protection promised had dissolved under headlines. Every attempt at a new beginning had been swallowed by the shadows of the man he had once been. He lived quietly, more quietly than ever, because now the quiet wasn't power. It was survival. Neighbors in his later years described him as polite, almost fragile. A man who kept to himself. A man who rarely spoke of the past. A man who appeared more like a retired accountant or aging real estate manager than someone who had once been part of a criminal hierarchy that stretched across states. That was the strange paradox of Vincent Palermo's final chapter. He had outlived the world that created him, but he could never truly return to the man he was before it shaped him. He didn't seek attention. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write books or chase celebrity. Unlike many former mobsters, he had no desire to relive the past for podcast audiences or television dramatizations. For him, the past was a weight, not a trophy. A history that demanded silence, even when silence no longer protected him. But the world didn't forget him. If anything, the world remembered him through a lens he never chose. Tony Soprano. After The Sopranos ended, after its final scene cut abruptly to black and left millions of viewers stunned, conversations about the real inspirations behind the show intensified. Journalists, scholars, fans, and former mobsters all weighed in. Some claimed the inspiration came from several New Jersey figures. Others pointed directly to the DeCavalcante family. And inevitably, the name that surfaced again and again was Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo. Not because he was loud, not because he was theatrical, but because his life mirrored Tony Soprano's in ways that no writer could have fully predicted. A suburban don, a quiet leader, a man who lived in two worlds and hid both behind soft eyes and steady composure. A man whose empire collapsed the moment the walls around him learned to listen. The comparisons frustrated Vincent in his later years, though he never said it aloud. He didn't like being associated with fiction, with dramatizations that portrayed mobsters as tortured antiheroes rather than men living inside a system built on fear and necessity. He didn't like seeing the quiet brutality of his old world turned into entertainment. He didn't enjoy knowing that the most intimate details of New Jersey's underworld, details he had lived through, had been transformed into plot lines for millions of viewers to consume casually on Sunday nights. But denial was futile. Whether he wanted it or not, Tony Soprano became the shadow cast by his legacy. The public didn't know the full story. They didn't know the nuance. They didn't know the quiet moments when Vincent made decisions alone, decisions that shaped the course of dozens of lives without anyone ever realizing it. They didn't know the pressure he carried, the diplomacy he navigated, the paranoia he absorbed. They didn't know how fragile leadership could feel when every mistake had the potential to end in blood. They only saw the resemblance, the archetype, the myth. And myths have a way of rewriting reality. While the public myth grew, the DeCavalcante family continued to crumble. Operation Heat didn't just arrest men, it dismantled the structure. It destroyed the economy of fear that once held the crew together. It disconnected the branches that formed the organism. After the indictments, after the trials, after the sentencing, only fragments of the old family remained, small, scattered crews with nowhere near the power or influence they once held. Some tried to rebuild. Others retired quietly. A few attempted to merge with New York families, but the criminal landscape had changed too much. Surveillance was everywhere. Informants were everywhere. Nothing about the Mafia felt sustainable anymore. The DeCavalcante name, once whispered with caution in New Jersey bars and backrooms, faded into history. And as it faded, Vincent's role in its collapse transformed from speculation into fact. Former associates blamed him for their downfall, claiming his cooperation destroyed the family. Others blamed the younger generation, the reckless behavior, the loud mouths who forgot the rules. Some blamed the television show, arguing that The Sopranos had drawn too much attention. And a few blamed the inevitable: time, technology, federal persistence, and the inherent fragility of organizations built on secrecy. The truth lay somewhere in the middle. Vincent didn't destroy the family alone. But without his testimony, the collapse would have taken longer. Throughout these years, he lived under government supervision, never fully free, never fully safe. The program protected him from external threats, but it couldn't protect him from the weight of memory. He carried decades of decisions on his shoulders. Decisions made in dim offices, quiet kitchens, noisy bars, and backrooms scented with cigarette smoke and fear. Decisions that often saved the family. Decisions that ultimately doomed it. The world around him changed faster than he could adapt. Smartphones replaced landlines. Digital surveillance replaced wiretaps. Social media replaced street gossip. Criminal networks went online. Violence grew less personal and more distant. Loyalty became obsolete. And through all of it, Vincent aged quietly, watching from the sidelines as a world he no longer understood evolved without him. By the mid-2010s, his health began to decline. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, the way a man begins to feel the weight of every choice he has ever made. He spent long days indoors. He avoided crowds. He avoided attention. He avoided anything that might risk exposing his new life, even though the public's interest in him had faded. He kept to himself because he knew the truth. Men like him don't get redemption arcs. Their stories don't end with forgiveness. Their pasts don't dissolve because they lived long enough to outgrow them. Their lives remain tangled in a web of contradictions, power and fear, loyalty and betrayal, family and destruction, silence and confession. Some journalists tried to contact him over the years, hoping for one final interview. He ignored them. Some former acquaintances tried to reach out, hoping for closure or clarity. He ignored them too. Silence had built his life, and silence would shape its end. But even in isolation, Vincent was not forgotten. Every time The Sopranos found a new audience, every time a critic analyzed Tony Soprano's character, every time a documentary explored the real Mafia roots of New Jersey, Vincent's name resurfaced like a shadow rising through fog. He became a symbol, not just of the Mafia's collapse, but of its transformation. The end of the old world. The beginning of a new kind of criminal underworld. A reminder that the archetype of the suburban Don was not fiction, but a reflection of something real, something delicate, something tragically human. And as time moved forward, the edges of his story softened. Younger generations didn't know him as a mob boss or a federal witness. They knew him as a footnote, a rumor, a name linked to a character in a show their parents watched. The fear faded. The influence faded. The legacy became something abstract, something debated rather than lived. But for those who remembered, the men who survived indictments, the families of those who didn't, the agents who worked Operation Heat, the journalists who documented the aftermath, the civilians who unknowingly brushed shoulders with history, the name Vincent Palermo still carried weight. Not the weight of fear, not the weight of respect, but the weight of inevitability. Because Vincent's story was never just about power. It was about the cost of it. The quiet decisions made in dark rooms. The internal conflicts masked by calm expressions. The men he protected. The men he betrayed. The life he built in shadows. The life he lost in light. It was about what happens when a man becomes the center of an empire he never intended to rule, then becomes the architect of that empire's collapse, then becomes a ghost wandering through the aftermath. In his final years, neighbors described seeing him sit alone on his porch as the sun dipped low over Texas skies, watching the world pass without recognizing him. A man who once controlled the flow of money, fear, and power now simply watched birds land on telephone wires and children ride bicycles down quiet streets. Sometimes he smiled at them. A small smile. A tired smile. A smile that held decades of stories no one would ever hear again. And in those quiet moments, something profound became clear. The real Tony Soprano didn't vanish because he was defeated. He didn't disappear because he was hunted. He didn't fade because he wanted to. He faded because time has a way of swallowing even the loudest legends. And Vincent Palermo, the man who ruled New Jersey with silence, eventually became exactly what he always claimed to be. Invisible. Yet the world would never forget him. Not really. Because every time a scene from The Sopranos plays, every time a viewer watches Tony Soprano wrestle with the duality of power and family, every time a conversation turns to the real-life inspirations behind the show, Vincent's shadow rises again. Quiet, unassuming, complex, human, flawed, powerful, haunted. The legacy of the real Tony Soprano is not one of triumph or tragedy. It is one of reflection, a reminder that the strongest men are often the quietest. That loyalty and betrayal run in the same vein. That power is never permanent. That silence can build an empire and destroy it. That stories outlive the men they consume. And so, in the end, Vincent Palermo lived out his final years not as a mob boss, not as a figure of fear, not as an icon of crime, but as a man who had witnessed both the rise and the collapse of an era. A man who carried history in his chest. A man who chose survival over legacy. A man whose silence once shaped New Jersey, and whose story now lives on in the flicker of a television screen, in the quiet corridors of Mafia history, and in the shadows cast by fictional kings built from fragments of real men. The legacy of the real Tony Soprano endures, not because he wanted it to, but because stories like his are never forgotten.